Good morning, everyone, everywhere now here. We are again having our discussion today. And one of the things I wanted to mention, because within the context of recovery and Alcoholics Anonymous, and I imagine many of the other 12-step programs, the set-aside prayer has been introduced some years back, but now it's become much more common. And it's also asking God to please set aside everything I think. Oh, the other point is that it's constantly been changed. From what it was originally, it's constantly morphed slightly to begin to address the issues that seem to be the stuck points in our thinking. But listen to what it says. God, please set aside everything I think I know about myself. I think I know about my disease. I think I know about the 12 steps, and I think I know about you. Set aside everything I think I know effectively. For our purposes, please set aside everything I think I know would be a good starting point, because it would be an admission that there's more than I think. And if there's more than I think, the limits of my thinking that I seem so defensive about and so reactive when people get close to them and so defensive to protect are really the ideas I have about who I think I am that are not true. And this is asking for an open mind. What is an open mind? Certainly not closed. Not in a vicious cycle and circle of trying to repetitively, constantly think about something and think the more thinking, the harder I think, the longer I think is going to resolve the problem. Asking for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my disease, the 12 steps, and especially you. God, please help me see the truth. Well, what am I asking? I'm asking for my thoughts to begin to align with something that is absolute, not something that comes and goes when I think about it or don't think about it, not something that isn't what it is when I think about it in ways that isn't what it is. It's starting to suggest that my thinking has the capacity to begin to entertain ideas that are not limited and not defensive and not reactive and not impulsive and not compulsive, which are all byproducts of maintaining ideas that I think are true, that I think are my truth, that I think are my reality, as though reality has a hole in it that I need to fill. And if there is no hole, I'm already full. And the only thing that gives me an impression that I need to do something about it in thought that's desperate is the idea that I'm not full and I'm not complete and I'm not whole, and somehow I am not a part of that whole thing. And that distinction is simply a thought, an errant thought, a wrong thought being thought of as right. There's a vacuum in that, an emptiness, a void, because it has no substance. The only substance it has is what I think it has. And if all I think it has is substance when it has no substance, I'm thinking delusionally about reality and truth. I have often suggested here that there is no ego and there are no lies, since they are all just manufactured in thought. They don't exist anywhere outside of our brain. It's just our thinking that's been plagued. And it isn't a surprise, like all new things learned, that humans may have been doing this. They've been doing it, as far as I'm concerned, as long as they have used self-indignation and righteousness to kill other people and oppress other people and suppress other people in the name of a thought. My thought versus your thought. And if your thought isn't as powerful as my thought because I can use force of some sort, you're less valuable than I am. And that has been pretty much human history. There's been a lot of that going on for a long time in many different ways. So Bill Wilson described addiction as a mental problem, centers in the mind. When I think about my thinking, I think about thinking itself. The self I think about is not who I am. It's a self born of thought. So all I'm thinking about myself is what I'm thinking about my thinking. It's all it ever is. So to mistake that and make believe at the primal level of my thinking that thinking about thinking is who I am, all of a sudden puts me on a path of making believe I'm the creator of reality. I'm the creator of truth. And now I need in every instance to defend against and protect against the risk of other thoughts that are contrary, including other thoughts of people who think their thinking is actually who they are and what they need to protect to survive. I need to stand on the ready and be on guard all the time. And I would suggest there is not much emotional sobriety, since sobriety is about sanity, in that approach to living and thinking. When I make
And
believe,
also, you don't. I saw something that says that you don't want people around you that are questioning what you're saying. Like somebody that's a narcissist, I guess they use that term, but that lives in this delusional world. If somebody starts asking questions and making them be accurate, they don't like that person anymore, and they don't have them in their life, I guess. Which makes sense.
That's happened here in our small group, where people ran up against other people's ideas and they got angry and they left and didn't come back.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? You don't want somebody that's kind of like opening up the reality to your fantasy.
Well, I don't think somebody opens it up. I think it's always wide open. And I suspect that's the constant anxiety and stress we have over thinking we can cover it up. And what is a cover up? But an attempt to hide something. What's hiding something? A secret. What do we learn in sobriety? That our secrets kill us. Why? Because we make believe they're true in the secret notions we maintain. But I would suggest there are absolutely no secrets in this universe. Everything is doing exactly what it's doing right now. It's revealing itself in what it's doing by how it's doing what it's doing. And if you look at nature accurately, you see that nature isn't arguing over what it's doing. It's simply doing what it's doing. And if our nature is nature, which I would suggest it would be odd if our nature wasn't natural, then we actually know what we're doing while we're pretending we don't by trying to cover it up and trying to act in ways that act oblivious to something that is clearly obvious. Stress and anxiety, inner conflict, emotional turmoil, all of the byproducts, depression, anxious disorders, all of these things that have been diagnosed as mental problems, I suspect are coming out of the stress created by opposing what we're thinking. We're creating an enemy within our thinking. We're creating a self that opposes reality, and we're constantly trying to negotiate with that self. Talking to ourself is actually talking to our thoughts. Thinking to ourself is actually thinking to our thoughts. We're trying to negotiate that as though it's a person and an entity, when in fact it's an illusion and a delusion, and what has commonly been thought of as ego as a false self. But in fact, the Latin root of ego is I. The word I. And what is I? I am thinking to think about the sentences we use. I am thinking to myself. Apparently myself is very distinct from who I am that's thinking. We even admit it openly. Again, no secrets. We talk about it openly. I was thinking to myself the other day. Really? Who is that self? It is thinking to thought. That's it. We're using thought, that is one of our major distinctions as a species, to complement our ability to be creative and innovative and express the loving nature of creativity that we are imbued with, that's helpful and useful and gainful for others, and turned it into an enemy encampment where we've built a fort of defenses to protect who we think we are, which basically keeps the enemy inside, living with us constantly, perpetually. Why wouldn't we feel self-loathing and self-hate and self-abuse? Why wouldn't those be typical and feeling less than? We're certainly not exhibiting the absolute enormity of an infinite, absolute knowing self or sense. I don't even think there's a self in that knowing. It's just a presence. It's not a self because it isn't a thinking. It's a knowing. It doesn't think of itself because it doesn't think. It knows. What would there be to think about if something knows everything? And it isn't to suggest that we're going to have a brain fart and all of a sudden just begin talking in terms that know calculus and every other language and all of the details that are going on with all of the people. Doesn't mean that at all. It simply means that if we make choices from a present state of peace and knowing, there's a good chance those choices are going to be, as Bill describes, intuitive rather than baffling by using the same old thinking that has baffled us for centuries and millennia.
When you think banana bread, though, this is what you think of, right? You don't think of any other.
I like that.
Mike, I'll mute. But good luck with the banana bread.
Thank you.
So if that's all we're doing, and at the most primary aspect of our human capacity, we have contaminated it with a thought that my thoughts are real and true, and I need now to fulfill them, the void of a non-substantive thought, because it has no basis other than in my thinking about my thinking. I'm probably not going to feel very well, and I'm probably going to feel depressed, and the impressions that are created are going to get more depressing as time goes on if I continue to maintain them. So I'm going to feel more and more anxious and feel this fractured state of disorders that seem to just be multiplying in modern society, and people doing things that people just say, I don't understand it. You know, every one of these mass murders, they're looking for a motive. I will tell you the motive: insanity. That's it. Simple. It's not sane to kill 10 people because you don't get invited to the party. And if they figured out that the guy didn't get invited to the party, or the guy in Michigan that just killed 3 people, I believe it was, apparently he had been slighted. That was their motive. He'd been slighted. Just like to Anthony's point, he was reactive over something that happened that someone else did. And what does he do? Kill 3 people. Like, that's a solution. We're all part of that by killing the self. We're trying to kill the self we created by not admitting it is a creation of something that doesn't even exist to begin with. Because like a lie only lasts as long as we claim it is true. And if this truth is what we're looking for in the set-aside prayer and so many of the other prayers, St. Francis' prayer and all of the prayers are basically asking for a broader view of what's happening, greater awareness. Why? Because we're focused narrowly on the thinking we do as the source of our solution, as though more of it, harder, will fix things. When in fact, things get harder and more complex. Inevitably, more problems come up that seem insurmountable. And the idea that feeling better all the time isn't even noticed is that we're trying constantly to feel better about what we're continually maintaining that's worse. And I would say that's a major glitch in the system. It's just like pouring more bad information into a computer when it's not able to reboot. And it's just the circle spins and spins and spins. You got to start over, reboot, let it go, meaning stop. And how do you stop? Noticing where you are, what you're doing. Acknowledge, wow, I'm central to this problem. I am the self-centered in thought that I think is who I am is really just thought-centered in thought. And when I start seeing it accurately, it starts becoming a little more obvious that all I'm doing is thinking wrong about things and thinking those things I think wrong are right. Now it becomes simply something I'm doing. And my perspective becomes very different because the awareness of what's going on is coming from a knowing nature rather than one subjected to this constant focus of thinking more about thinking. And thinking that thinking more about thinking is going to fix the self we think we are and all the frailties and all the fallacies that we seem to be hiding and avoiding in the interactions we have with other people. It's not honest to do that. It's dishonest at the core, which is why my contention is there is no emotional sobriety in that.
It's like making a banana bread without putting in the right flour or putting the oven on the wrong temperature. It's not going to come out right.
Or making it in Arizona where we can't have any of it. So the point is, this is super simple. And through history, Bill Wilson introduced something that through history had not been introduced, which was the chance for people who were suffering from alcoholism to get sober, freely get sober, not sit around in a crowd of people hugging each other, hopefully avoiding a drink for a day and dry drunk. He wasn't interested in that. That wasn't the point. He said clearly that the symptom was the bottle and alcohol, and that the disease was mental, and the mental obsession is at the core of the disease. And what's unmanageable in the first step is not the alcohol. It's when we stop drinking and admit we have no power over it and we're free from the idea of drinking, all of a sudden we actually start facing the things we thought we could tolerate and feel better by drinking. So to be sober and free of alcohol and continue to try to feel better about what we're doing is wrong would not be the goal of sobriety or emotional sobriety, because it would short circuit the whole process, just using a new excuse to feel better about something we're still doing that's wrong. And the wrong is simple. Who we are is not what we think, period. What we think is something we do. When I think about my arm, I do not think I become an arm. But when I think about my thinking of itself, all of a sudden I think that's who I am. That's interesting. It isn't who I am, it's just what I'm thinking. And I'm certainly capable of thinking. And I can have all the opinions I want. And I can think of anything I want. And I can think that what I'm thinking is wrong is right. And I can subject myself to all the peril and misery of those things. But the book says avoid the deliberate manufacture of misery. Meaning this is a choice to suffer those consequences. It isn't something imposed on us. It's not a coincidence until you see coincidence as a coincidence happening simultaneously with what I'm doing and in my choices. I am free to make all the choices I want. And when I feel condemned, I have chosen to feel condemned. This may not make sense. And obsessive thinking tends to hear what the thinking is thinking, not what is actually being said. So if you're listening to this, it may not penetrate right away, or it may seem kind of vague and unrealistic and preposterous, which are all good notions when the thing you're doing and thinking is vague and preposterous. So consider that the reactions you have may be the reactions you're having to what you're doing rather than what you're hearing. And the hearing actually gives you a little perspective to start noticing how your responses are responding and your reactions are reacting. And the difference between the two is one is repetitive, trying to fix something that's broken that will never be fixed. And the response is actually a responsibility, meaning the ability to respond. Very different ways of looking at things. When I'm functioning, I have an ability to respond. I have an ability to look at things from an absolute state of being, peacefully, knowingly, and even not even think I know or am at peace. It doesn't require my thinking I know that I'm at peace. But naturally, if I begin to be aware that peace and truth and love and all those things are constants, they're not optional and they're not negotiable. They don't come and go. There aren't more or less of them. When you're dealing in an infinite realm, it's something incomprehensible to thought, because thought is designed to really navigate the environment we're in this seeming relative world. But it is also designed to express that absolute knowing without thinking about it at all. So that's the sort of jumping off point today. And Fed is a new participant. Fed and I met back in November at a meeting in Marina del Rey, and he's got great taste in music, and he has sort of adhered to what's going on here and been very active, which I appreciate, and I'm happy to know him. Michael, good to see you back here in Thai. Anthony, enjoying France, and Gabe. So what are we going to do with what we got today?
Well, there's a lot of good things. Great summary you made, Jack. But I won't say what I think, but I definitely want to have a say after everybody else says where we should go.
Yeah, I like the step aside prayer, along with the St. Francis prayer, reminds me what I try to work on every day, that I am stuck in my thoughts. And I listen to the mental obsession discussion when it's out. I listen to it on my way to go to sleep. So I rewind it in the mornings during my chores while I wake up and work. And like it's just the streamlined thought is that our thoughts aren't real. It's what I get out of it. And our thoughts are so not real that we really need to crack that down, because our thoughts become actions. But even when we don't turn them into actions, they're still heavy thoughts that affect like our thinking and henceforth the reasoning, which henceforth can become actions. So the step aside prayer and the St. Francis prayer, and I listen to like Ram Dass and people like that, you know, they say you're not who you think you are. You're just not that person. And these prayers just kind of help. They're more tools. They're tools that, like, when I say I think now, as I've been more and more sober every day, I end that thought with a period. If that makes any sense? Like, I think. And it really helps because it just gives the thought less power. But, you know, things happen where I'm working, I'm answering email, and I relate a lot of things to how I used to think, how I kind of still think, but I put a lot of reps into thinking negatively and thinking reactionary, and these prayers and like words like help you kind of build a tool to check that at the door, to visualize it as a thought that goes away. And thoughts do go away, and thinking and knowing are two different things. I know my thoughts will go away, but what I'm building is that bridge in between, to like understand, I guess, to understand, and then henceforth practice putting the thought on a shelf, putting the thought away, throwing it in the water.
So a few thoughts for you directly, if I'm hearing you correctly, and I think I got most of it. If we're willing to do what we're doing as we're doing it, including thinking obsessively, you will start seeing that you know exactly what you're doing. It will not be a secret. It will be so obvious. And the only thing that keeps it seeming oblivious is this act that we have going on, thinking that it's happening to us. Even with Ram Dass talking about we're not that person, is to suggest that there is a person there. And the persona that's created is just a bunch of characteristics that we've developed in thinking. It's nothing more than that, and it's never been anything more than that, right? So to think of it as a person and not us is to think, well, now I have another person living in my head that I don't even know. It's just another repetition. So when you say they get heavy, any opposition to what's actually happening creates pressure, and that pressure creates weight. And that weight bears on us. We feel it. It isn't because it's real any more than going to a horror film, everybody in the movie's dying. But it certainly stimulates effects in our body that are very similar, just like in a dream. When I have dreams, often I'm going down a set of stairs or walking, and I trip and I jump out of my sleep from the trip, right? Feels real because I'm imagining it. I'm subjecting my brain to all of the imagery that would qualify, just like a movie or a book or anything that I interact with that isn't actually there, that's telling me about something. I begin to develop this imaginary, these ideas about it, this narrative in my brain. It isn't to say we shouldn't be doing that. That's actually one of our greatest assets. We've just turned it into a liability by making believe it's something, as you were pointing out, true and real. So if the thoughts are just thoughts, then as thoughts, they're perfectly designed to satisfy our drive to survive and thrive. Perfectly. And yet, if I was to get in a car perfectly designed, a Ferrari, Anthony has a Ferrari, if I was to get in Anthony's Ferrari and decide I was going to drive like a Formula One racer, there's a pretty good chance that car would not come back in running condition, or it would not come back. From a lack of understanding, a lack of application, a lack of use. So a couple of other things, more even fundamental. Thoughts are actions. And they precede every single voluntary action that we ever take. Every single one of them is based on a thought. And thoughts are choices, the content of our thoughts. Thoughts may not be a choice as far as the brain doing what it's doing. It's always thinking, right? So I don't even need to be paying attention to it, and it's going to be thinking. Anthony was talking earlier about autopilot. So my thoughts are going to be thinking all the time. My brain is conscious. My body is running 24 hours a day, and the brain is basically managing the information that's coming in, even when I'm asleep, when I'm not paying attention. When I think I'm not there, it's still doing what it's doing. So thoughts are actions, at the most fundamental basis because we're choosing them, first of all, and they're happening. So things that are happening are actions. They're interactive too. They're interactive with everything else that's going on. They don't have to be right or real to be in that formula. So if my thinking is toxic, I'm going to pollute that environment that I'm interacting with, and certainly not feel very good about myself doing that. Because the self I'm thinking about, first of all, isn't even who I am, and I know better than to think that. But the insanity of it has me continue to think someday I'll get it right, someday I'll perfect this thing, someday I'm going to think hard enough, be confident enough, more and more ambition, more and more drive. I'm going to get there, rather than say, I'm already there, now, here. There's nowhere to get. I'm already who I am, as we are, now. What does Bill say? We will intuitively know. Intuition is knowledge beyond reason. And you were defining the difference between knowledge and thinking. So reason is something thinking does. Understanding is something thinking does. So if there's knowledge beyond reason, that means there's no reason and no understanding and knowledge, none. So where is thinking left? In the dust. Just something a body does as a component of its ability to function. And how well we succeed is how well we actually learn from the thinking we do in relation to the choices we make, whether they be good or bad, based on good and bad is typically based on whether we get what we want. Generally, what we want is something productive from the choices we make. When we don't, we feel bad. Feeling is a good indication that it's a chance to learn that, oh, this is not the path to getting what I want. If I think about having a meal and never make the meal, if I don't make the banana bread, I got nothing to eat. I can think about eating my whole life and I'm going to starve to death, right? I'm not going to do the thing that actually allows me to function. So we're discussing here our human capacity as spiritual beings. How do we, as beings who know better than the thinking we do, because we know, and we're aware, how do we begin to function in a way that actually applies that? And also notice the potential we have for dysfunction and start to say, oh, if I'm feeling these things, I'm doing those things, period. Simple. And all of a sudden, accuracy in any way will dissolve rather than constantly resolve, trying to feel better about something that we're maintaining as worse because we're not paying attention to the core of the problem. And sobriety is about honesty because it's asking us to look face first at what we're doing. It's asking us to look at the disturbing things we're doing, to be accountable. And a full accounting means the books balance. They're not out of balance. They're not unstable like our mental capacity seems to be when we're thrusting ideas back and forth about how to fix it, but we're doing it all within the teeter-totter of thoughts, not actual our knowing awareness, and not saying, oh, if I'm the knower, if I'm the observer, wow, that just thoughts all of a sudden take on a very different, they don't become as big and consuming. All of a sudden, they just become a thing I'm doing. A lot more freedom in that, a lot more choice to do something that's productive, helpful, gainful, useful, beneficial. So contemplation and consideration in our discussion is just to begin to engage with these thoughts, notice how you react and you're thinking about them, and try them on like a pair of shoes. Go take a walk in them. Watch how they are, where are they applicable? Where do they apply? How do they apply? And my experience is that people start getting better before they even notice they're getting better because they stop doing a lot of things they used to think they were plagued by. It just sort of disappears. And feeling natural doesn't feel unnatural. So it feels so normal that it doesn't feel like there would have been anything else we could have done but that, because that thing had always been present and always been available. We were just choosing to preoccupy ourselves with these single-digit points that we constantly try to focus on and fix.
Have you heard the expression, Jack, that if you shake an alcoholic hard enough, the family tree hard enough, a codependent falls out?
No, but codependency is just another form of relying on other people for what we're unwilling to do ourselves and blaming them for what we're responsible for.
Today, I kind of realized that maybe my codependency is something I just go, oh, so I'm codependent or not. I don't really care. But I realized one of these big situations I had today was this guy wants me to buy a bed from him, but I really don't want to buy it from him, but he's put some time into measuring it or whatever. So I feel bad that because he's going to feel hurt that I might say I want the bed. And I realize that's so codependent that my big problem is I'm worried about what this other guy is going to think. And I know I don't need this bed from him. So I'm realizing everything I do is for other people. That's my struggle. I always want to impress somebody else. I want to.
You know why?
Why?
Because you're completely unimpressed with the self you think you are.
Yeah. So I need other people to validate it.
Well, they can't, because you're going to just feel sicker about it when they do, because you're going to think, well, doing more of that's going to work, and you're going to get further off the path. But the essence of it, and for Fed 2 being here the first time, is starting to notice that it's our experience that's giving us all the clues we need, all the information that we have, and whether we're willing to look at it honestly or not is the decisions we make about it. Another thing to your point, Fed, about the St. Augustine prayer, think of what he's saying in there. It says, by self-forgetting, we find. Right?
What do you do next after forgetting? What's the next thing? You just sit like a plant? I feel like that's
no, but it actually begins to allow thinking to be utilized by our knowing self. So we start doing things that actually happen rather than thinking about things that aren't happening. We're just, and it isn't even, he says forgetting, and I don't think it's forgetting. I just think it's starting to see that it isn't a self at all. It's just thinking of itself, thinks of thought. That's it. It's thinking of thinking. That isn't a self. That's just thinking of itself. What does it confirm? Thinking, not who we are, not reality and truth. That's a big leap to take to make believe that all we are is what we think. And what do? We're ashamed. We keep it to ourselves. We think to ourselves. We talk to ourselves. Why? Because if we ever let it out, everybody'd say, what are you, fucking crazy? Answer, yes. To think that's all I am is crazy. When if all I am is connected to everything that is, with everyone else that is, and all things that are. Everything, not some of it, not just the things I think of, not the stuff I have title to, not the doors I have keys to. All of it is part of our realm. If it's that vast, thinking becomes very quickly something simply we do, a choice. And interestingly, the book even says we straighten out physically and mentally. The other one is by forgiving, one is forgiven. Interesting that we ask God for forgiveness when in fact we're being told that simply forgiving is forgiveness. Why? Because we're stopping the ideas we have about other people and other things that we've resented and hated and thought were wrong, and started to say, it was the thought I was struggling with. What I am forgiven is what I begin getting, the freedom, when I start accurately assessing that what I've been doing in my thinking is wrong. When I think somebody else is wrong, I am thinking about something I'm thinking that's wrong as them rather than me. That's another fractured state of awareness trying to make believe that I am not intact, I'm not whole, and I am made less by them. Imagine how magnificent the power we've given other people to think differently than we do and think that they diminish our capacity. It's all just another idea that the thinking of self we have is opposed to the thinking of self they have, and we're going to fight until we get it right. It's never going to be right because it's wrong, period. It is by dying that one awakens to eternal life. What is dying? This sense that this self has life. It isn't even dying. We're finally just admitting there is no life. It's been a crusade on behalf of sustaining a life by thinking and thinking more about our thinking in the name of trying to get ourself right, when in fact the self we're thinking of isn't even who we are. It doesn't have a life. To see it accurately, it just vanishes and disappears because there's no conflict, there's no oppression, there's no pressure created by opposition and no resistance created by the opposition, so there's no persistence of it continuing to go on. So when it seems impossible to stop, just notice how much investment you have in maintaining it, continuing. Because the only impossibility of a lie is the idea that it's true. And as soon as I realize a lie is never true, all of a sudden a lie is a lie. There's no impact. There's no weight. There's no pressure. There's no conflict. No emotional turmoil. No division. Awareness begins to wake up because I've been asleep delusionally in a trance, making believe someday I'll get the vision of myself whole and complete, when in fact it doesn't have any basis to be whole or complete. Nothing. It's just fantasy. When fantasy becomes reality, it's obviously a good definition for insanity. Sturgis, good morning.
That's assuming he slept.
Either way.
Got that little one probably keeping him busy.
Hey, gang.
So maybe just morning.
Yeah.
all the time. Morning all the time. A new day every day.
Yes. Like moments, always constantly new, always everything possible is always possible right now. Pretty broad stroke compared to feeling that things are impossible by lockstepping us into ourselves into ideas that aren't true and then continue to maintain them as though things will get better while they clearly are getting worse in the immediacy of our own experience. And we're hoping sometime in the future that never comes. It's like forever. It never comes. What kind of hope is that? The ever-present nature of the ever-present nature is present. It's always here. It's always available. It's always the essence of our experience and our human experience and life itself in all forms. No small thing compared to the smallness of the thing we tend to make believe is truth and reality.
I wanted to bring up codependency, if you don't mind, just for a second. I was thinking that it really is a lot more than what I've been thinking of it as. I kind of just never even look at it, or it's not my problem. But I think a lot of it, that's what I'm always trying to do is I really am trying to please other people. It's a codependency to really make sure everybody's happy. When I do mental obsession, I'm thinking of everybody's outcome. Is he happy? Is this person happy? Is that person? It's a form of severe codependency almost. Instead of just doing what I want to do and calling it good.
The life of the self you think you are is dependent on the life of other selves that don't exist thinking better of you.
Yeah.
And what does the book say? We over rely, we become overly dependent on other people and they retaliate. Why? Because they're protecting themselves. How much good are you doing them?
And if you would have asked me, are you codependent? Or yesterday, I would have said, no, not really. But today I'm thinking maybe there's a lot more there. Maybe that's what I'm focusing on, making sure so many people are happy that it's almost impossible to do. At some point, it's not making myself happy.
What do you mean it's almost impossible to do? It's just simply impossible. You know what's great about impossibility, Anthony?
It's impossible.
Exactly. And you know what that means? But
at one time I did do it, so I guess it's not impossible.
You thought you did it, and here you are still struggling with it, admitting you didn't do it. You thought you did it. You thought you bought people off. You thought you bribed them enough with your good wishes and all the stuff you did, and you thought they were happy with you, but that didn't create happiness because all you were doing was serving the same interest in them that you're serving in your own thought of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So insanity doesn't really insanity is impossibility. It can't exist. It can't even be true any more than a lie can be true. And so subjecting ourselves to it is literally a choice to continue maintaining the thinking that creates it.
Or
now,
what if
I am not suggesting there aren't people out there with physical, mental deficiencies that are insurmountable. Maybe there are, I don't know. But I can suggest that if we don't have those insurmountable difficulties and the ones that we seem to have are created by what we do, this world would be a much better place for people of that sort that don't have any hope to be taken care of.
Or maybe the codependency goes to myself. Maybe I'm like how I always turn everything if I do it to myself. What if I'm always worried about how I think about everything and how I'm always
That's all it ever is, Anthony.
I'm trying to please myself so much.
That's all it ever is. You know why you're trying to please yourself? because you're so displeased with the self that you think you are. That's all it is.
Yeah.
Good morning, Jackie.
Good morning.
Morning, Jackie. Just a thought though. Maybe the codependency goes to myself.
I'm pleased with the self I am.
Anthony, it's all about a relationship
And
you
that's the
have to
problem.
us.
Wait, just going back to it, when Jackie says she's happy with it, that means nothing's going to change. Because if she's happy with everything she's got, then that means she's just stuck in the same. There's always should be something that you're kind of trying to work on, I would think.
No, it's yes and to life. I'm happy with this and I'm excited for the next thing.
Yeah. And I
I
think
think-
that's the realization is that from this course, again, so to speak, that when you realize that the things you're thinking really aren't right, because you come to the course going, well, everything I think is right and everybody else is wrong. Then you realize, well, maybe I'm not always right all the time. Maybe there is no right.
Anthony, when you are constantly fighting for the rightness of a self that doesn't exist, it is going to appear that right and wrong are your struggle. And that trying to get all of those fractured ideas,
Right.
it's like buying a kaleidoscope and thinking that you're going to, the more you use it, the quicker
The more you
it's gonna
turn it,
straighten
if
out.
I just keep turning this, it's going to fix itself.
So, Anthony, if you
Yeah.
you can think that you can deal with all these little things that you're doing, or you can look at the actual core of what fractures into all those ideas about the little things that we drown in, constantly
Right.
think we've got to get them all right, rather than see
Right.
what's the cause of this? What is the cause? And the cause is making believe who you are is what you think. To any degree you make believe that is true, you are going to have fractured states of awareness that seem impossible and insurmountable to overcome because you are trying to pretend that you can turn a lie into truth, impossibility into possibility. And to give yourself an impression by feeling better of it along the way that you're making progress, the only progress you're making is convincing yourself that you got this, while you are teetering on the brink.
Right.
of
I was just going to
insanity.
say, or maybe making sure somebody's on the other side of that teeter totter. Otherwise, the whole thing goes wrong. If there's not enough weight on that other side, there's a real problem.
Well, there's no problem if you don't mind sitting on the ground. But think of that.
It's always.
Aren't people struggling to be grounded? I'm serious. I mean, we're
Yeah.
looking for that sense of place, that sense of
Yeah.
comfort, that sense of ease.
Yeah.
If we are creating a relationship or our own experience with the self that doesn't exist, that we would have to loathe and hate because it is made of hate and loathing and fear. It's the only nature it could possibly have because we know it doesn't exist in anything other than what we think. We know it because we know. And we wouldn't bear the consequences and the effects, the anxiety and the stress and the sense of displacement when somebody doesn't do what we want and we don't get what we think we want and all that kind of stuff wouldn't occur. We would simply be flowing with it, the way Jackie just said. Whatever's next is, I'm ready for it. In a fluid fashion rather than in this sort of brittle appearance that always feels broken because it's so brittle. Any crack completely destroys the whole thing. We can't maintain it because there's nothing to maintain. We can't manage it because there's nothing to manage. That's what unmanageability is about. It's starting to see that mental obsession is not based on anything real. It's based on thinking about thinking about thinking about thinking about thinking about thinking and making believe somehow that's our only source. That's our ultimate go-to, only thing we can do. It's just a choice. It's an option. Our thinking is always going on. What we think about is a choice. How we use it and utilize it is a choice. And if you consider that everything happening in your body right now is being managed by that brain and you're not thinking about it at all, you might get a glimpse into the capacity that your brain has to actually express your greater knowingness and our greater knowingness. And start to realize, wow, there are trillions of interactions going on in our body right now that we're not even thinking about, and they're happening perfectly. And you know why? Because if they weren't happening perfectly, we would be hurting and somebody would be talking about that. And as a result, we would know something is wrong, which is what pain is about. It's telling us, it's an indicator something's wrong. When we turn it into something to escape from, we're maintaining the problem that's creating the problem and making believe we're going to get better by avoiding it, not feeling it, not expressing it, not talking about it, not having it, literally. You can't let go of something you claim not to have. It's part of this whole idea of how do I stop it? How do I stop it? How do I stop? We all want to stop it. We don't want to notice that we're constantly starting it by even thinking about it as something to constantly stop. I mean, that's just another direction of maintaining the problem. It's not a clear view. It's a presumption that if we stopped it, everything would be great and our self would be fine. The self would still be an enemy because it has no basis and it is a lie. And we are not good lying. We are not good liars. And we aren't liars when we lie, we just lie. And it impacts our whole bodily system. It doesn't make us liars. It just is something we're doing. We've gotten so accustomed to thinking who we are is what we think that we think anything we think is who we become. So if I lie in thinking, I become a liar. Not so. I just choose to lie. I choose to dysfunction. I choose to create a mess. I choose to suffer depression and misery. Again, for people that isn't a choice for and they absolutely have no control over it whatsoever, this discussion would not apply. But I would say they are in the very, 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 very small fraction of the 8 billion people living on this planet. And I would suspect if we were all thinking healthy, cures would be invented for things that seem to be impossible diseases today. And solutions to energy would be solved without creating byproducts of pollution and corruption and things that literally disintegrate our natural habitat. Just happen naturally. People would be happy to do it. Wouldn't just be commercial endeavors. It'd just be a gift, just like the gift that we've been given for everything that we have. What do your brains say?
Feel a lot of relief.
Yeah. There's not a lot of stress in accuracy. If you take on a challenge that creates stress, it's part of the challenge. It's not some phobic ghost that we make believe is haunting us and compelling us in directions that are unhealthy and unwanted and having us experience that sort of haunting nature. It's just a challenge. We're either going to succeed or we're not. But natural stress, just like natural fear is literally addressing something that's happening and giving us very clear ideas about what to do to resolve it, or at least do our best to avoid it and minimize it. Good to see you, Type.
Take care, everyone.
So time changes dramatically when you're dealing with actual fear, the fear in our body that's instinctive. All of the other fears are actually backfiring. Flight becomes running from the problem. When the problem's inside of us, we go with the problem wherever we run from. Compulsions are an example. Compulsions are all suicidal tendencies. They're killing us in some way, large or small. Doesn't have to be heroin to do it. It can be potato chips. Eat enough of them long enough, they're going to have an impact on your health. Not to suggest some aren't better than others, and it isn't something to do. Just that compulsions tend to do things that are never healthy. I've never known anybody to have a compulsion that was healthy. Because they're trying to escape something that's diseased. We do something diseased to escape into it and think that's the problem. It's out there now. It's not me. I'm not at the center of that problem. It's the alcohol. It's the drugs. It's the this. It's the that. It's everybody does it. One excuse after another. While we're choosing and choosing and choosing to continue to redo, repeat what we're thinking.
One of my favorite, not one of my favorite, but one of the things that stuck with me, I study like my favorite filmmakers, and Martin Scorsese went through a lot of, drug abuse in earlier times. And he said something, he was quoted saying something that, along with a lot of people sharing in meetings and just talking to people in life, he said, "My addiction now is cinema." And what I immediately thought, like making movies is an addiction. And what I immediately thought was, is that still good for you? Is this bad for you? Is there no hope? Like, are we just imperfect enough to that? Is anyone aside from the Buddhist monks or whatever, like nirvana out? Like, or no matter what, are we always gonna have? Is that demon like gonna have a home, even if it's like the
As
healthiest
long
home?
as we make believe it's true, yes, it's going to be there. That's the whole thing. The fact that we even think of it, think of the narratives we give it. It has a home. It lives in us. It's a persona. It's a character. It's a this, that. It's just made up. It's literally a fiction. So one of the things also, to Martin Scorsese and other people who are artists, being passionate about something is not an obsession. It's actually what love is, paying attention to what's happening. It's really doing your best with what there is to do the best you can with what there is. And I would say he's done that remarkably well. So his seeming obsession may be a distraction to some degree and something, because again, if we have historically been maintaining this sense of self that's made out of thought, and it isn't who we are, we've historically been developing ideas and ways of operating that give us a better way of dealing with it, that are obviously much more productive and helpful, but haven't quite resolved it. The thing still seems to people still seem to talk about the demon always being there. Well, if the demon is always there, it's the ideas we have that aren't true, that are constantly being maintained, that give us that impression. It isn't because it's something distinct from us, but the whole idea of addiction is that it's happening to us and not being caused by us. It's the primary idea that this is something I have to do. I have no other choice. And in fact, choice always allows the choice not to choose. So we use the word choice in vain because we're not using it as it actually is. We're using it as it is to serve the self we think we're going to hide and keep and maintain by saying I can't do anything else. There's always the option not to do whatever we're about to do. Always.
And Fed, I'm glad you brought up that word, because addiction and it's I hear it being used a lot, and at times I'm questioning whether it's being applied correctly. Reference being, I saw a gentleman, he posted something like he ran 2,000 days in a row. Like it's just this, he was celebrating that. And someone commented like, "Oh, he's addicted. It's unhealthy." And I was like, well, I don't think that applies. Like, so I did a little bit of digging into like the meaning or definition of addiction. And one of the things that stood out is and I'm reading it, it's despite adverse consequences.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, well, is there an adverse consequence to this guy being in the best shape of his life, running for the 2000th day in a row? I don't see that. But for someone to label it, oh, he's addicted, there's something wrong with him now. It's the lack of understanding of the word addiction, which, like Jack just said, a lot of people don't even understand what that word really means and if they're where that stands with them. So like Scorsese saying he's addicted to it. I mean, I guess, has there been an adverse issue with it? I don't know.
Well, again, we're so imbued with the ideas we have that we think they're true in all ways. So when we become passionate about something or inspired, it very much seems like addiction, because the lie is looking very, what the CIA tells their people is to tell a story that contains things that actually happen, but weave the things you want to have believed into those stories. It's exactly this thing. When we start actually seeing honestly what we've been doing, the things we start doing that are passionate, not causing, because inspiration will overcome a lot of problems in our physicality, because they're not creating this internal strain that undermines all of our bodily systems. So a guy could potentially run 2,000 miles and have the collagen and all the stuff in his knees and the cartilage and all that stuff not only sustained, but actually develop in a direction to accommodate what he's doing. we have diminished our body's capacity to function because we've been stressing it so long. It isn't even been allowed to start doing what is possible for it to do, as far as I'm concerned. And people are all looking at, age. How do you postpone death? How do you do all this kind of stuff? Well, one way would be not to cause stress for your whole life. That would be a pretty good start, because it is recognized as the one thing that undermines everything that we do, all of our bodily functions. So my sense is healing is natural and disease is not. Disease is a function of insanity. Disease is a function of allowing the body to degenerate in the name of not looking at the adverse consequences that are going on and thinking. I had a guy on the phone yesterday I got a 911 call from somebody. The guy had been drinking for 9 days, 24 hours a day. And he was kind of just coming out of the stupor. And he said, I'm fine. I'm a killer. I got strength. I can do whatever I want. And I said, that's exactly the thinking somebody thinks who's just about to kill themselves. And he said, well, I haven't died yet. And I said, well, nobody ever dies till they die. So having had it happen before doesn't prove it won't. It actually proves it will. And the people who die of suicide or of drinking and things where they're not planning on it, they always call them accidental. They're not accidental. To think because the person wasn't thinking about it directly and not seeing that they were thinking about it indirectly by every little step they were taking on that path is to make believe they're not responsible for it. And it's inevitable when you act that way to end up suffering those consequences. Some people survive somehow. But one thing to your point, Michael, that's important here, that is true in Alcoholics Anonymous and all the 12-step programs. Nobody can diagnose our problem but ourself. And when I say ourself, I'm actually even wrong in that, but our own choice to think about what we're doing accurately. There's nothing I can say or do that is ever going to help anyone if you think you got it and it's going to be okay and everything's fine and all I'm doing is this, and now that I'm doing that, everything feels better and that's the end of it. I'm just going to do more and more and more of this. Nothing I can do to talk you out of that. Because it's all our own. The one thing we have is choice at our root, to turn the switch on or off, to say yes or no. And awareness is very interesting because it's perplexing to the rational concepts we have to actually face something that seems so abstract. And yet it's the thing we're primarily sourced in, that we know better. And it's an indication of how long we've been relying on thinking that we keep thinking we need to understand it to finally know it, rather than concede we already know it. And it doesn't matter what I think at all. I can think anything I want. And what I'm going to do is create consequences, bodily consequences and awarenesses in my bodily language. They're going to tell me whether I'm on the right track or the wrong track. I'm going to know it immediately. If I've been desensitized from years and years and years of trying to be numb to what I'm feeling, to try to feel better about what I'm doing by trying to feel numb to what's happening, it may take a minute or two to thaw and start noticing how sensitive our awareness is, and how it isn't even sensitive in a sensitive sense, but it's aware in an aware sense that knows everything that's going on. It's aware of everything. It isn't some short thrift that's giving a little bit here and there like we do in our own thinking. So that primary issue when we're talking about how to stop it is to start to see that we're the ones that are choosing to continue it. And we're the ones that are causing it, each of us. Not me for you, but I don't help you if what I'm doing is talking about it in ways that serve the interest of maintaining it by giving you better ways to think about it and continue to maintain it. I don't help you at all. That would be a dishonest, hateful, spiteful, contemptful approach. And largely, that's what most of our friendships are based on. The idea that I will stay away from those buttons and you will like me for my staying away from them and I won't go near them. And when I do, it's over. You've betrayed me. You betrayed my trust, the people say. What is it? What am I trusting? That they're not going to go near the limits that are killing me. How are they helping me? What kind of friendship is that? It's sick. So addiction is a decision made by the individual, not by the group. And We can watch people do also, like Scorsese even, I would say he's passionate for what he does. By far.
Yeah. So I'm interested in it because he said it.
Yeah.
But then again,
yeah.
I'm like, we are unreliable narrators, just like Henry Hill and Goodfellas. So like, yeah, just went full circle with that thought.
But to the degree, Fed, that we're continuing to obsessively maintain this idea about who we think we are, those things probably are combinations of obsessions while they're also passions.
So that's possible. That's a possibility.
Yes, exactly. Within the thinking, it's absolutely part of what happens, because the free person would say, I mean, I have a nephew who is like a master in college football.
Mm-hmm.
He probably can't do anything else. So all he's ever done is what he loves to do. It's all he does. He never wanted to do anything else, so he just does that, and he's a master at it. His name is Liam Blutman, and he has I forget the podcast, but he does conversations and talks about college football, and he knows every player. He knows everything. He's been doing this since he was 4. There's nothing else he wants to do, so there's nothing else he does. He's completely enthralled by what he does. So I would say love, that would be the nature of love, is being not consumed by it, but recognizing that if it is in fact the nature of our existence and we all share it, we are already in it or part of it. And even these words fail to address it in any meaningful way, because it isn't even a thing to be in. It's just a thing to be of. Maybe that's better. We're of it. If that's the source, then we have a knowing greatness that as we begin to allow our thinking to stop preoccupying our attention, our human attention with our thinking, that knowing nature is obviously going to begin to express it ways exactly as the book says. We'll intuitively know how to handle situations that used to baffle us. The bafflement, the complications are coming from constantly reapplying the same old ideas, that somehow they're going to get better if we feel better about it. And what are we feeling better then? What's worse? Why not just eliminate what's worse and start to see that it really isn't there except to the thinking we're doing about it? And this has been a pretty common historic tendency to think this way, at least since the mid-1800s, when the whole idea of ego was developed as an internal false sense of self or an internal self-image. Think of the self-image. What is the image but just thinking about what we're thinking? It's really not reflecting anything other than itself, just like a mirror. What does a mirror do? It reflects anything that's willing to stand in it. Doesn't care if it's ugly or beautiful. Doesn't care if it's got its head lobbed off. It's going to give you a reflection. Has no interest in what's there at all, but it will give you an accurate reflection of that. If the reflection of what we're doing in our own thinking is making believe that that reflection creates who we are, we become the creators of reality, which is opposed to reality and truth. It isn't in favor of it. So what do we end up? In disfavor to many. Naturally. It's not a coincidence until, again, coincidence is seen as a coincidence, simultaneous, synchronously, immediately happening now. Now. And even for us, now isn't even an ever-present state and an absolute present state, because there is no place in a non-time-bound state. So for us, here and now are human things. We're addressing our human experience. If that other thing isn't in time and space, it's not a coincidence that everywhere we go, it seems to be. Because it doesn't have a dimension. We can't get outside of it. There's no limit in it. The limits are our thoughts. And to the degree that we think they're true, we're not looking at thoughts accurately because we're making believe we're the creators of reality. That's a major problem and has been through history. The bigger the group thinking that way with the same ideals, the bigger they seem to get together to figure out how to destroy somebody else. That's a sign of weakness. That's not a sign of strength.
And isn't it weird that we only see the colors of the spectrum that we need to survive? We don't see the other ones.
Well, but we exist within the entirety of the whole electromagnetic spectrum, the whole thing. That's the nature of the universe. So what's interesting there, Anthony, is the invisibility of it does not mean it's not there. So when I don't think I'm thinking what I'm thinking, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean I'm not causing havoc in my own experience. It means I'm using denial to make believe that if I can pretend it's not happening, it's not happening. That is like something I did at 3 really well. At 67, it's a little old.
Or so you thought you did.
Well, to being consumed with those ideas then, there wasn't a lot of perspective. There wasn't any experience to speak of. But yes, you're right. Talking about it can be a little tricky because it literally removes most of what we've always talked about. And as far as I can see, all that's left is, okay, what do we do with this now? This magnitude of awareness. What do we do with this? How do we express this? What do we do with it? Kind of where do we go? But it's more like, how do we be? How do we just be? And I would suggest we've always been.
Where do you draw the line to where you're being a good friend? Like you're talking about being honest with somebody, but you know that if you were just brutally honest with somebody, they wouldn't want you around. So there is
no brutality in honesty. None. Those are words we use to make believe that we can't do things, which means we're being dishonest in the things we're doing and wondering why we call it brutal. The brutality we're facing is the internal grind that somebody else is maintaining. And we think if we talk about it, we're hurting them. Imagine how hurt they have to have your thought and words all of a sudden feel brutal. How impossible is it? You're not doing that to them. You're actually confronting what they're doing and giving them a chance to see the brutality of this inner communication that's going on with the self that doesn't exist, trying to get it right. We've created a fort, like a military outpost, where we built an impenetrable fort and have the enemy inside.
And I got to say, just for the group's benefit, I'm acting like I know a lot. And then I just got a notification on eBay that I won some Marilyn Monroe worn gloves for $250. I'm like, I'm just killing. You could also use this to buy things that you like. It's a great mental, it's like psychological judo, right? It's using the weight of your thoughts to get, that's what judo is, where you use the opponent's weight. So you use these thoughts to gain from them and to use the weight of them to do something else with them, right, Jack?
I would say if there's any weight to them at all, they are in opposition to something and fighting for something, because
wouldn't that be a good way to handle this when somebody says, oh, what's this mental obsession course about? It's like kind of like judo, where you take the oncoming force of this thought and you don't fight it. You just let the thought go with it.
Well, you know what happens, Anthony?
You liking that, Fed? You like that, Fed?
The thought dissipates. It dissolves. There's nothing there.
Mental judo.
There's nothing there to fight. There's nothing there to avoid.
Some of those. What's that?
There's nothing there to avoid, Anthony.
I say that this course is about thoughts and examining them and what thoughts lead to obsession. I have never talked to anybody about this course though. So I don't disagree with you, Anthony.
Well,
but yeah,
keep in mind too, this is not a course and it's not a teaching. It's just a conversation.
Yeah, it is to me.
It's a conversation. If the source of knowing is something we all know, then we all know what we know. Every one of us, and it's not a secret. And this discussion is aimed at beginning to talk about that knowing collectively, so we can begin to confirm in our experience that that does in fact not only exist for us, but everyone and everything, so that we begin to actually be a witness to the reality and the truth that we've always been a part of, rather than continue to develop new narratives of how to figure out how to sort the thinking out, rather than just let thinking do what thinking does when it follows the leaders. Rivers don't argue over their direction. They just go where they can go. Our thoughts are arguing with our own thoughts, and we're wondering why they're heavy and seem like we've got to go out of the way, like they're an opposition force, even in your metaphor, Anthony.
And they're in your own voice too, is the scary part. When you think, you hear your own voice.
Yeah. Well, imagine talking to yourself. That's schizophrenia at the root. I am talking to myself. Who the hell am I in that sentence? If I choose the thinking and now all of a sudden choose that it's a self, that's something I created. It isn't something that's real. It's just a narrative I've created in thought.
I'm glad you brought that up because I always go, so I reference a lot of cinema because I would argue I was obsessed with, I don't know how I had the time to watch all these movies growing up, but I watched them all. A Beautiful Mind, John Nash, physicist, won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
The ending of that movie fascinated me because the people he created were still there sitting down. They just weren't as loud.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I'm thinking today, I'm like, all right, I want to bring up A Beautiful Mind, Beautiful Mind, Beautiful Mind. But like, he was diagnosed schizophrenic. But I'm like, what about those arguments that I have in the shower that I'm always winning? Or like, I'm talking in the car, maybe not to myself, but like playing out a scenario and future tripping about something. Are we not all schizophrenic, or do we need like to some capacity a little bit?
The distinction between the two, Fed, is thinking that what those things we're doing are real and true rather than just simply entertaining thought. That's the only distinction. You can have all these characters you want in your mind. You can talk to them all. You can develop them. Think of what Tolstoy did in his writing, what great writers do. They develop all kinds of character and they imbue those characters with hundreds of other people's characteristics so that everybody reading about them has something to relate about that one person. Because they become full-bodied. They seem to come to life. But what they're doing is basically creating a narrative. Those are things that we're able to do. And I would say that is the creative urge that we are blessed with to express the imagery that we can create, not create imagery as though it's true and then wonder why we're in a life and death struggle within our own experience to just do anything that feels better than that, rather than begin to see that that's the ultimate incubator of the potential. Imagination is the incubator of potential and creativity, and starting to say, wow, maybe there's a solution here we've never even considered. If all we ever get are results that seem to reveal themselves as toxic at some point. When it comes to energy is a great example. The universe is all energy, and we can't seem to figure out how to create energy without creating a byproduct of toxicity. It's pretty interesting. Wouldn't that typically be coming from thoughts that are toxic?
Mm-hmm.
That think the only thing we can produce is something that produces toxins, and then we can look at it and have some perspective. And rather than say, wow, we've been doing this so long, maybe we ought to look at what we're thinking about what we're doing. And maybe the thinking's toxic and the pollutant is not the toxic chemicals, but the actual process that we're using to rely on the thinking about the thinking and who we are and all that kind of stuff. So those there's nothing wrong with having 18 people sitting in your brain and talking to them, especially when they're imagined. And when fantasy becomes reality, that's basically defined as insanity. And it isn't something we can't do. It's something we're perfectly capable of doing. But when we do it, it is a delusion of thought that we are relying on to make believe that it's true. That's all that it is. It feels real because we hurt over it. We struggle over it. And what's interesting is feeling is not given to us to prove reality. It's given to us to sense our awareness of our environment. So when we feel bad and hurt and have pain, it's telling us something we're doing is wrong. That's what it's saying. It's not saying this here, use this to justify reality and truth. It hurts, so it must be true. It's saying something's wrong in your calculation. It's not working. It's not going to work. Like any math problem, if one segment of it is wrong, the whole thing's going to fail. And we have done a lot of things that are wrong within stuff that works, thinking it's going to someday be true, when in fact the wobbly nature of the things we impose eventually are revealed. It's not always obvious immediately, but I would say it's obvious we're doing it immediately enough to begin to talk about it and just say, we do not have any obligation to continue. None. We're not committed because everybody else seems to do it all the time. And this is just the way humans are. And people call human nature greed and all that. I say, no, that's the sick part. That's the part we're nursing that's wrong, that's sick, that we think is real and true. It isn't. It's all make-believe. It's a masquerade parade.
Malarkey, tomfoolery.
Yeah. Well, and I think Sturgis is kind of a Shakespeare expert. He's still here, but Shakespeare has the I don't remember where it's from and what it is, but he talks about fools rushing in. Right? Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Yeah. So fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Where would that be but in a delusion? Why would angels fear to tread there? Because they know it's not a place it's a place of imaginary reality. They know what reality is. They're angels. So what are the fools rushing in but the thoughts that rush in to save us, to fix it, to help others? It's just a thought. My sense is he was on to that and talking about it. And I don't know that he was thinking of it from a thinking standpoint, but my sense is that we feel like fools when we do the things that follow the foolish thoughts. We just feel it. We know it. We feel like we're imposters. We feel illegitimate. All those sensations are not accidents. They're reflections of our awareness. And to see them clearly is to begin to disband the maintenance of thinking that somehow we need to fix them and feel better than them, when in fact the management of something is the maintenance of that thing managed. And even if it's delusion, all we're maintaining is the delusion. To do that chronically is an addiction. It's an addiction in thought. It's been at the core of human thinking since, I suspect, Cain killed his brother in righteous indignation. And then God came along and said, "Where's your brother?" He said, "I don't know." Talking to God. I mean, that's a pretty good example of our absolute knowing state right now, lying in the face of that and seeing how preposterous it is that Cain would tell God he didn't know when God knows everything and is aware of everything. And we do it in our own present state with an awareness that's absolutely present and whole and complete, and wonder why we don't feel good and think feeling better all the time is the goal. Think of the amount of times people spend feeling better. Nobody comes to me and ever says, "I want to feel worse and I want to have more negative thoughts." Something isn't being looked at accurately beneath that surface or seeming surface that isn't even a surface, because it's on the surface, superficial. We're all witnessing it. We're seeing it. We're looking at it in the ways people interact with each other. I had an 80-some-year-old, I was behind a woman on a street the other day who the light went green. There were 10 cars behind me and she just sat there, didn't go anywhere. And I bumped my horn. She flipped me off, 80 plus years old, easily, through her sunlight. Flipped me off. Then she pulled into the middle of the intersection and stopped her car. Hard stop. Like she was going to prove to me that she wasn't going to be pushed around by anybody honking. And I said, I just kind of motioned, "This is the time to drive. This is the drive time. You're in your car." And she goes another 20 feet and slams her brakes on and gets out of the car and runs back to mine and starts swearing at me and yelling at me. "You can't push me around." And I said, "It seems to me you decided to drive and you're not driving. There's 10 cars behind me. You hear them honking? They would like to move through this street, not wait for you to figure out what's going on." But the reactiveness, clearly I was involved in triggering this. The reactiveness is becoming more and more common because people feel their right is to express all that hate and anger and volatility. In a way, it's very true because they do have the right to express it. And we've been keeping it to ourselves as though that's a social veneer that makes us better by looking better, when in fact it's brewing, and people are brewing and brewing and brewing. And like all the volcanoes, they're exploding all over the place, doing these absolutely obscene, absurd things that make no sense. And the people looking at it are saying, well, we're looking for a motive. Again, we talked about this earlier. The motive is they're out of their minds. How's that for a start? How about we just get down to the basic insanity of it? We don't talk about it openly and we don't talk about it publicly, accurately. We think of it as just some strange brew. And what was it that caused them to do this? Clearly, it wasn't sanity. Clearly, it wasn't peace and love. Clearly, it wasn't stability and comfort. Clearly,
she's probably loaded too. That's what I start to think now. So many people in the rooms talk about they're drunk driving, like an abhorrent amount of people, to the point where I was surprised. I've drunk drove too, but like I'm always like, this person, she's probably loaded. That's what I was thinking the whole time.
Yeah.
But
Could have been. But we don't have to be under the influence of alcohol to be under the influence of anger and hostility and fear, because the ultimate alcohol is trying to overcome that thing. That's the root of addiction, is the actual mental obsession that has, how many of us felt that incredible relief when we had a first drink or a first drug? Yeah. Why did we feel incredible relief if we didn't feel uncomfortable before that first drink?
Was it a friendly kind of honk, like, hey, the beep beep, your lights on, or was it laying on the horn, like, what's wrong with you?
And that rises. I gotta say, you're not helping with my anxiety.
Because you feel like you finally belong or something.
Somebody's got a TV or something going on in the background.
You see other people expressing their like smiles and good natured self. So you finally feel like you belong when you take that drink, and you're now part of society.
But that suggests before that drink, you felt you didn't belong. Again, to the point. You're in this sense of starvation, this sense of disconnect, this sense of displacement, this sense of, I don't know where I am. I don't know where I belong. I don't know where I fit, because you're trying to fit into a body of self that doesn't exist. You're trying to make up. If thoughts make things up and have the potential to make them up, then our makeup, as we talk about it, is made up. It's just a bunch of characteristics that we decided on that we thought were suitable to navigate and promote as an appearance. How things are is not how they appear, and they are not how they seem. Things are as they are, not as they appear, not as they seem. Appearances are projections. They're just things we look at on the surface. People say that's me in the mirror. I said, no, that's actually a reflection of you backward in the mirror. And it's a perfect reflection in terms of getting all the characteristics, but there's no blood, there's no air, there's no sight in there, there's nothing going on behind that scene. And that's exactly what we create as this self we think we are, by creating an image of thought thinking of itself, and think that self it thinks of is who we are. It's the same thing. It has no life. It has no breath. It has nothing. They even put mirrors to people's faces to see if they're responsive, if they can create condensation or glass, like EMT guys do that to see if there's any breath coming out, any heat, humidity. But that person in the mirror can't breathe, can't think, can't talk. And that's what this inner self is that we think exists, and this persona that we think it is, that we now think we need to project. And in the same way we express through compulsions trying to escape, we're trying to promote this thing as being real and true and sell it to everybody, to have them see the best in us, when in fact what we're promoting is the worst of us, because we're making believe, rather than just say, look, I'm an actor choosing to be this today. And this is a characteristic. I'm going to be an idiot today. I'm going to be an asshole. I'm going to be irritating. I'm going to be annoying. I'm going to be caring. Those are just choices we make. And we end up collecting those things in a made-up form that says, this is who I am. It's a story. It's a fictional story. Nothing wrong with that. It's only when we begin to cross that line and think this fictional story is autobiographical, and that what is made up is true and real, and what we think about must be real, and who we are. That's the transition. That's the whole source of the problem. And interestingly, the nature of us that's full, complete, whole, absolute, is exactly what we try to deny, and exactly what we try to ignore, and exactly what we try to pretend isn't there. The one thing that's absolute in our existence is the first thing we pretend isn't there when we think we have our own reality. What's the solution in the program? A spiritual solution. Why? Because there is no problem in a spiritual realm. It's absolute. It's complete. There's no friction in it. There's no pieces and parts. There's no them and us, them and they. There's only us. It's all we. huge transition in beginning to say, oh, something so simple could cause so much problem. Yes. Just like the constellations looked and the planets looked like they did these wild orbits when we thought the Earth was at the center of the world. Ptolemy, Ptolemy, look up his name. We've talked about this before, created these charts of how the planets work. They're beautiful, but they're crazy. They got the planets going back and forth and all that to justify our thought that we were at the center of the world, the universe. When I think I'm at the center, myself is centered, it's only my thoughts that self is centered in. So it's made of thought. It's not made of reality and truth. It's made of something I do. It's like thinking because I build a car, I'm a car. Or I build a house, I'm a house. No, I have a house, I can have a car, and I have thoughts. I have thoughts. What does that mean? I can do with thoughts what I choose. Why? Because I'm free. And that goes for all of us. As distinguishable as we think we might be and would like to be, we all have the exact same premise in terms of who we are. Essence is essential. It's not optional. And to begin to consider that is really an awakened meditation. To begin to see,
That's what I was talking about earlier.
This is true regardless of what I think. So even when the circumstances get difficult during my day and I am challenged in ways that tax my thinking, it doesn't mean my absolute nature isn't there. It means that I am feeling a little awkward about utilizing my thinking. And I'm thinking more about the problem in thought and thinking as a result, this other thing might not be there for me, rather than say, I'm intact, I'm whole, I'm complete. And what I'm thinking about may not be. And now my thinking gets a chance to actually come from peace rather than disturbance. If I'm choosing from disturbance, I'm going to choose disturbing things. And to choose from peace, chances are I'm going to choose functional things. I may not always. There's an easy disconnect there. It takes practice. It takes application. It takes doing. But if the doing I'm doing in my thinking is screwed up to begin with, the doing I'm going to act on is going to be the same and constantly keep me in this ping pong batch or match with a self that doesn't even exist, that I'm just imagining. I'm going to create problems to pretend it's out there, somewhere else, sometime else, someplace else. And I do that really well, I want to mention. I'm very capable of creating problems to give myself a chance to notice how far I need to seem to go to get my attention, to the desensitization and the numbness and the pretending I do still today.
And not only do you want other people to keep moving ahead and not stop when they're supposed to go, but you're like that with your own self. You're harder on your own self than anybody wanting to get more done.
Well, the impact, when we use other people as excuses to feel like they hurt us, there's nobody or no thing that can hurt us more than something we do in our brain in the exact place where pleasure and pain are registered.
Yeah.
You can't have a greater impact than what we do. This is why the choice of recognizing the insanity is left to each of us to begin to say, yes, I do those things. These are actually things I'm doing. And wow, if I just start talking about it accurately, even in my own thinking, you'll notice a huge difference because there will be no conflict in that. Because when things align, they don't need, it's kind of like applying 2 + 2 is 4. Once you know that, you never need to go back through the mechanics to apply it again. You just do it. You function on that basis because you know it works. And addiction is trying to constantly make what works never work and think that more and more of the same repetition is going to work someday.
Or maybe she was shouting at you, didn't you see that little cat that was underneath the tires there that you could see from your car? That if I would have gone, I would have run it over.
She was definitely not talking about that. I was pretty much the culprit.
There's always that other possibility though, you know?
Jack, what's an example? So you say to this day you do. Sorry, can you repeat what to this day that you do? I want to say, so if you do to this day what you do still in your mind, but you know that 2 + 2 is 4, what else do you throw on that knowledge that 2 + 2 is 4 that makes?
Well, I don't challenge that. I don't challenge that. I don't challenge that, Fed.
Okay.
What I see is that I still have ideas that I know aren't true because I still do things as though they're fine and going to work out that end up failing miserably or creating problems I don't expect. And when expectations are based on thinking that I think is right, I think all that should ever happen is what I expect. Right? Well, you follow that? When I think my thoughts are true, I'm thinking the only thing that can possibly happen here is what I imagine. And that's just delusion. So there are many times I find that there are thoughts I have. And keep in mind, if we've been doing this historically, we are successive generations built into a thought stream that seems to be real, seems to be true, seems to be accurate, but just has basically been repeated so long that we take it for granted it's true and real when it isn't. So there are cultural, all kinds of things that are imbued in our experience that we might believe are true that aren't true. And as I get more sensitive to my awareness, those things become more obvious. And what I used to think was a small problem, I begin to see the magnitude of the potential problem I can create by maintaining what I thought was small. Because as it comes into view, I realize this is the same exact problem, recurring, that will create as big a problem as I need to finally concede that I'm at the center of it. The longer I deny it, the bigger the problem's going to get to try to bring balance to it. But I'm trying to put it out there so that I can have some perspective on what I'm not willing to admit I'm doing here and noticing the disturbance of. That sensitivity to the awareness takes a minute to become, it starts to grow in time. And it's easy to say, oh, that's no problem. That doesn't, rather than say, wow, if it's indicating something wrong, I might want to concede that maybe the decisions I'm making here are not that healthy. Maybe they are not what I'm thinking. Maybe there's some reason to stop and breathe and look and say, what is it about the limits of what I'm doing that might be worth noticing? And just a little, exactly what the book says, pause, restrain of pen and tongue. But my sense is we have turned being kind and tolerant in terms of our communication into being dishonest as another layer of trying to make people think they're better than they are and make us feel we're being better to them than they are by being nice about things that we could actually help them by confronting and let them get reactive and upset and be with them in that process and say, yes, like this conversation. This is something I do. This isn't something that goes away, has gone away completely because the potential for it is always possible because we are free to do what we want. If we weren't, if we were only condemned to doing the right thing, we would be a plant or a mineral or an animal that isn't thinking necessarily about what they're doing, though animals do. But plants, for instance, they just know what to do. There's not a lot of thinking going on. We've been given thinking. Whatever the reason, purpose, whatever, we have it. If we can think of our thinking, it doesn't turn it into reality and truth. It simply means we're contemplating our thoughts. That should be a high point for us rather than a degenerate low point that we create. And the only distinction is just seeing that they're thoughts we're thinking about. So I have plenty of fixed beliefs. I don't even know what they are right now. I'll say that there are things I think are true. Management styles I've developed to think I can handle things that aren't accurate. So I end up with problems that come up that seem a little sickening. Like Anthony was talking about the nausea that he felt from this relationship that he went through. That same kind of nausea, I realize I have that almost 24 hours a day. It isn't that powerful. It isn't what it used to be, but it's a noticeable sense of like a gut feeling, right? It's probably part of my natural bodily language telling me you may want to halt before you get to the cliff's edge. You might think you've got 8 steps, but maybe 7 left. You may not need to get there to figure out that there's some danger, because that awareness would be incredibly perceptive and aware And my ability to actually be sensitive to it, I've spent a lifetime trying to become numb to it and pretend it's not there and go through all these internal machinations to try to pretend it's not happening. So one of the areas I find it in is one of the things that helped me to begin with is I started to do, when I thought the thing I was about to do was wrong, I just do it. And I started to get freer about doing it. And all of a sudden I started to have greater clarity that I had the clarity. And now that I can act on it, I'm not turning it into as big a problem. Often it comes in things I say to people. I get impulses to say things. And sometimes that other voice, that critical sort of counter voice, argues as though that self I still have that I think is me is still fighting over what I'm about to do. That reactive self doesn't want my spontaneous self to speak honestly. So when I have those thoughts, the first time I had it happen was probably 30 years ago, but I had this impulse to ask somebody something. And then I immediately had this voice come back and say, that's stupid. That's ridiculous. And I thought, oh, that's just a thought. That's just a reactive thought so I stopped and asked the guy the question that I had, and it led to, I was in real estate at the time. It led to $2 or $3 million worth of real estate deals from the one question. And the question was, is there anything you want me to know before I leave? And I was riding away on a bike and I got the impulse. And then when I heard the reaction, I thought, oh, that natural sense of knowing is actually speaking. And here I am with this other voice arguing over it. That's an indication to stop and ask. And so I asked the guy, is there anything you want me to know? And he said, did you know? And I said, that's interesting. I just told somebody last night that would be the property that would be perfect for them, but it wasn't on the market. Out of seemingly nowhere. But that's our nature. That's our knowing nature, is to function synchronistically in what seems to be miraculous. But the miracle is that we can live as long as we do and make believe that that's abnormal and rare and unusual rather than the absolute nature of our existence. So listening to it is starting to realize that we can do whatever we want. We just don't have that voice that seems to inflict this idea of what I have to do and should do and can do and might do and must do and wished I'd done. And all that stuff is a debate going on with a persona that doesn't exist. It's just thinking about thinking. And all those things are possible. They just aren't productive. And it isn't to stop them, but when you see them for what they are, you can sit there and watch them, just like listening to the crowd at a football game roar when the other team gets something and you don't like the other team, and just let them do what they're doing. Doesn't have to completely turn your whole experience upside down. But if you think also about the ideas we have very often, that we shouldn't be doing what we're doing, think of how impossible it is to maintain that idea while we're doing exactly what we're doing. This is going to this point of just starting to notice what you're doing. If we're doing what we're doing and start noticing what we're doing, there's great clarity in that because there's no conflict in it. To think we shouldn't be doing what we're doing while we're doing what we're doing is a major dysfunctional effort to undermine what's happening as though we can. What's happening is going to be happening always wherever we are, as it's happening, not as we think it should, not as we wished it or hoped it would, as it's happening. That there's a basis to think from. What's happening is happening. Question is, okay, what would I like to do about this? How would I like to impact this? What would my choice be here? And part of it is to say, this is my choice to begin with. I am manifesting everything that's happening as it's happening. And if I begin to act responsibly and aligned with what's happening, there's a sense of knowing that immediately starts offering ideas that I never would think of when I was stuck in a loop of constantly thinking I'm doing what I have to be doing, or must be doing, or should be doing, or can't do anything else other than. That addictive thinking doesn't offer me many options, but to continue to think addictively. And it's a reliance I'm placing on it that's causing it. It isn't happening to me. It's happening as a result of my choice. So an awakened my sense is it's easy to sit with eyes closed in a quiet place and meditate for 20 minutes and help thoughts dissolve, because we're not utilizing the thoughts. We're not asking our body to do anything. We're closing our eyes. We're asking not to interact with everything. But the 12 steps said we had a spiritual awakening, and I would say awakening means eyes open. And if we're practicing principles in all our affairs and have a message to carry, it would be that we're actually interacting with what's going on as it is going on, honestly, rather than making believe that what's happening isn't going on and thinking that we're going to have a message to carry that's going to be valuable to anybody. The messages that Alcoholics Anonymous started with, we tried to carry this message to others. Bill didn't exclude anyone from that initially. And the trying is exactly the point made earlier. It's up to the individual to decide their own state of mind, because it's been up to that individual to choose their own state of mind the whole time. We can think we don't, and there may be people who are seen to be so insane as to not be able to make that choice and only be able to make the choice they're making. But I would suggest that if it isn't some biological genetic disorder, that there's some pain attached to it or some historic idea or trauma that has never been faced, has never been dealt with, and has never been allowed to be dealt with, because the treatment of the people have basically tried to have them act better rather than actually uncover and discover and discard what it is that's brewing in there. So when I talk to people, I live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of people who are insane, and I talk to them as honestly as I can, and it's amazing how quickly they come around. I just address what's happening as honestly as I can, and the difference in their communication is dramatic.
It sounded like you were saying you like to talk about what caused the trauma with them. Did I understand that right? You like to dive into that part of it?
Well, I'm presuming if they're insane, the present traumatic stress that comes from making believe who we are is what we think is 24 hours a day for anybody maintaining that thought. There's no greater stress that we can create. It doesn't mean you can't go into experiences that push you so far beyond your comprehension that you just don't know how to make sense of what happened, and you live with that sense of dread and that sense of overwhelm because you can't process it. But the problem is, if we can't talk about the subtle things we're doing that are wrong openly, what are the chances somebody of that caliber that's gone through that kind of thing, just like the guys who come back from war that are just expected to blend back into society immediately, having witnessed friends whose heads were blown off and all kinds of things that are just hard to relate within the context of sanity, because it isn't sane to witness that. It isn't sane to go to war and blow people up for the sake of a thought. But we've done it for a long time, and I'm not suggesting we shouldn't or don't. I'm suggesting we do it. It just probably isn't the highest point of our capacity in terms of resolution between other humans. But to witness those things pushes us so far past what we imagine is even possible that it's somewhat blinding to imagine ever even facing it. And the trauma isn't in the circumstance that's now over, but the maintenance of the ideas about it that continue. It's the present. It's what I'm doing in the present with anything that's ever happened to me that causes the ultimate trauma. Not to say those things are right and they're not hard to deal with at all, but it's what I'm thinking about it now, and thinking about it in ways that think it's happening to me, and thinking about it in ways as though it's still happening. All of those things continue to create the same narrative and the same destructive force that the original impact had. And we actually maintain it rather than dissolve it by pretending we're going to somehow hide it and pretend it's not going on. And as a society, we do not do well accepting people's experience and listening to their trauma. We want to feel better. We don't want to hear that. That's negative. Why do you always want to talk about negative? It's not. Positive comes with negative, naturally. People are struggling. It's worth admitting it. It's worth conceding it. And if we are struggling, we're not there to even listen to what they're saying at all. And we're not going to hear anything they say, which only helps compound their problems. So it's not very generous or loving of any of us to operate on that basis. When the Romans and the Greeks used to come back for war, they gave them platforms in the communities they lived in, the villages, to share their stories publicly with everybody so everybody knows what they went through. And they could come back with a sense of compassion from the people, because the people would be listening to circumstances that they can't imagine, and all of a sudden have a common bond with that person, rather than just send them home and tell them to start working and wonder why someday he goes ballistic, literally. There was a method for that because there was recognition of the fact of the insanity of it and the inability to just put it aside, that it impacts people. Police officers are facing that kind of stuff all the time in what they witness on the street. You can't be numb to it. You can't be unaware of it. And if you act like that, you become to get very desensitized, and thus very, very incapable of actually interacting in ways that are helpful. We create that corrosion of public trust by the lack of trust we have in our own actions and thoughts. And thoughts are actions, again, Fed, for starters. They're primary actions. No voluntary action that we ever take outwardly ever comes from anything other than a thought. Unless it's a knee-jerk reaction, literally, or a spasm, or a tick, some of those things that are just seem to happen. So if that is somewhat not true, and it's largely true in terms of being that thoughts precede actions, it's the thoughts that precede the actions that we're focused on here. It's the action of the thoughts preceding those actions that we're focused on here. If there are exceptions to this, so be it. I would say there are none, but what I say does not mean there aren't any. Yet to use those exceptions as excuses not to look honestly at what you're doing is a major problem. It's what we've all learned to do so well, that this dilemma even needs to be thought of, talked about openly and honestly, because it isn't being discussed openly and honestly. So the awakened state gives us a chance to interact with our functional capacity and see how well we're doing with what's happening, by how well we're interacting with what's happening, by how well things go. Literally, is it useful for more than me? And if it's useful for more than me, how many is it useful for? And the better I get, the more useful it will be for everybody. Because if I can, or you can, resolve something honestly, and to know how something works and talk about it that way, you give everybody the opportunity to apply that. If it truly works, it's not just something working for the self I think I am. If it's truly working for life and reality, then it becomes functional for everybody to utilize, just as Bill did with the 12 steps. Anybody who comes in, admits they're an alcoholic, and applies those steps tends to get better. Doesn't mean they all stay sober forever, because the practice is all the time, now, presently. Practicing principles in all my affairs means everywhere, every now, every place, every interaction, always. And if I'm dishonest and thinking I'm feeling better because I go to a meeting and do some yoga every once in a while, that's great. That's nice. But it just shows how easy our own experience can be manipulated by doing a little something productive in the face of doing a lot that isn't productive when it comes to this internal grind. For maintaining this internal fight, there's no escape from it as long as we maintain it. And to feel trapped is a very good bit of insight that the brain tells you you're trapped in what you're doing. And the same thing we're using to think actually tells us we're trapped. Pretty good indication that we've got a very solid built-in guidance system. Closing thoughts?
That's kind of a funny statement for a mental obsession group.
Well, the beginning of the rest of the week, in my experience, is where the application of any of this really begins. Talking about it here is the chance to see that it's possible to talk about, beginning to express it in our experience, is beginning to see that our nature is much more intact than we often give ourselves credit for. And it can be challenging too. Not everybody responds well, but this isn't about telling anybody anything. It's about beginning to express yourself in ways that are accurate enough to be trustworthy enough. And even if what you're expressing is wrong, when you begin to admit it's wrong, it's honest. You do not have to be right to tell the truth in terms of your own experience. And I don't mean you're telling the truth in the truth way, but you're being honest about what you're thinking. If what you're thinking is wrong, what I've learned to do with people is say, look, I'm going to tell you something I'm thinking. It has to do with what I'm thinking. I am thinking this. This is my thought. I'm going to tell you. I'm going to let you hear my thought. It has nothing to do with you, but I'm going to have you hear my thought. About 12 times in, I say it, and they say, well, you can't think that. Why do you think that about me?
I haven't been able to stop thinking about the banana bread. Is that a mental obsession?
It's probably just hunger. So the point is that we can be open and honest, and we can start to see that people do react often, not to what we're saying, but what they're thinking about what we're saying. And as I get better starting to think about what I'm thinking, I begin to see that other people are struggling with the exact same thing. And I can choose to antagonize them by creating all sorts of other lies about what I'm doing, or I can be more honest in the process and get better at communicating with them and seeing that their reactions have not so much to do with me, while they interactively have an impact on my experience, but they're really only impacting what I'm thinking about what they're doing. And start to see that they're doing the same thing. When I have a camaraderie in that and realize this isn't something we're all doing individually, it's something we're all doing collectively as individuals, seeming individuals. It gives me a lot more compassion to be with people, experience people, talk to people, and walk through that with them so they get to the other side of what we're talking about with me intact, rather than, I don't want anything to do with you anymore. I can't talk to you. You don't listen. All that kind of stuff. And then just shut them off and shut them down until time passes and you kind of mosey on back into their space, but never really address it. When those things come up and they get left undone, the next time I'm with that person or the next time the chance is there, I bring it up. I want to talk about it. I don't want to avoid the things and think I'm helping at all, because I'm hurting all. And start to actually just get honest about my experience. My sense is we all know so much better, because we know that when we start witnessing anything that comes close to simplicity and application of something that makes sense, it immediately takes hold. It immediately becomes a part of our awareness, because we're simply aligning with it. We're witnessing it. It's like when you see one of those aha moments where you finally see something. It's not because you're finally seeing it that it's that way. It's because you're finally thinking in line with how that thing is. That's the aha. If it's always there and people know, then we all know always exactly what's going on, and just have developed this very sick approach to talking about it and thinking about it. And talking is a byproduct of thoughts. If you listen to people's thinking, if you listen to their words, you're going to hear what they're thinking. Even if you listen to the words closely, you'll hear that very often they're saying exactly the opposite of what they think they mean. They're admitting things openly, couched in this other way that we talk, where we kind of mean, well, you know what I mean, kind of thing. And you hear people that when I grew up, the kids said that all the time, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? I'm like, fuck.
Yeah, I was just joking.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're really saying I was just choking on the words.
Good friend of mine, every 2 sentences, he's like, you know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? No.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
I don't. Do you know what you're saying?
Here's the irony. We know exactly, but we don't necessarily think we do. Mm-hmm. Very interesting distinction again. It's generally the thinking, if not exclusively that we're struggling with. It isn't anything else. So the camaraderie is just beginning to see that we're all struggling with it to some degree, or it wouldn't be happening to the degree that it's happening to seemingly all people around the world. And it happens in different seeming ways, but I suspect this same basic thing has been at work for a long time for people to be so quick to jump on bandwagons that seem to collectively make believe that some other group is worse than this group, and that justifies killing them or hurting them or opposing them or segregating them, or and somehow there is no segregation in an infinite, intimately connected life. None. In a present state of knowing awareness, there's no distinction whatsoever. And that's very disarming to the arms we take up. So,
hey, Jack.
Hey, John.
Can we just backtrack to the brutality of honesty that you mentioned before?
You mean meaning that it's not brutal?
No, because it's an accusatory thing, which I have been pinned. And you said that, I'm paraphrased, but you said that the sharing of thought with and not sharing of thought is a dishonesty.
Well, the accuracy of my thinking. My thinking can be wrong, and I can be honest by sharing a wrong thought. Doesn't mean I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
It just means I'm being honest about what I'm thinking.
Right, but then you said something about friendlessness because of the sharing of thought, right?
Well, what I said was when we make believe that avoiding other people's hotspots or triggers is helping them, it is helping them, but it's helping them to figure out how to be more conniving in the ways that they're hiding their triggers. And what's happening is their triggers they're going to pop up. They're going to explode because they're growing. Things either grow or contract. And if I try to avoid something that is wrong, it's going to grow naturally. It's not going to dissipate.
I understand that. So, but someone would say that there's a insensitivity or a dispassionate aspect to the sharing when you know that someone's not in accord with your thoughts about whatever it is.
Well, they don't have to be in accord with your thoughts. It's your thoughts that have you think they should. And I think what's that?
As soon as you mouth those thoughts.
Yeah, it's pretty quick, isn't it? The reaction. It's like playing tennis where the guy is connected to your tennis racket. It's immediate, often. But I think what you're getting at, John, and correct me, stop me if I'm wrong. What I learned is that if I'm sure about what somebody else is thinking that's wrong, I'm asking them to react and defend what they're doing, because I'm talking about them rather than bringing it back and saying, look, this is what I am seeing. And this is my observation of what I think you're doing. I don't know that this is accurate. I don't know that it's true, but this is my observation. And I thought maybe we could talk about it. Maybe it would be helpful to talk. If I'm a friend at all, I would rather talk about things that are not easy to talk about and know that you have the safety of doing that with me than to just basically cater to the ideas that feel comfortable while the discomfort is being fostered and grows.
But what if you're, this is just hypothetical, but what if you're sensitive enough to realize that there's a weakness within someone and you cite it? Does that change things?
Yeah, it generally creates their reactivity. You're going to trigger their defense.
But on their end, don't you think that the same thing is heard?
Do you think they're hearing you? No.
Well, it's when it comes out of my mouth.
No. But if anyone is defensive, if reactive thoughts are the go-to, we're not hearing what people say, we're hearing what we think they say. And we're either going to hear that what they're saying is complimenting what we're doing or attacking what we're doing. So if you are conciliatory and saying, I know you might struggle with this, but that's your business, and I don't want to get into that, and I don't want to pry, and I don't want to push, we're being conciliatory. That's like fawn in the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. It's trying to make nice with the person so they don't react. But it's helping them think. Yeah.
I understand that. But on the other end.
Which other end? Their end?
The fight. Well, we just talked about fawn. So
yes.
On the fight end, their reaction to what you said, to what I said, say, let's put it in the first. So I comment my thought, and then there is a fight response. That's because they don't want to hear what I've said, right?
Well, I mean, I suppose it could be all kinds of reasons, but you're unveiling the reactiveness. And that's why the point of saying the wrong thing often creates an opportunity to confront the thing you might not get to otherwise. That thing that I would generally used to say I don't want to say because I don't want to trigger that, I do say now because I'd like to trigger it and like to have an opportunity to get better at dealing with that sort of hostility and that reactiveness and that cavalcade of stuff that comes out. When I'm with somebody else in that, I'm beginning to actually concede my own limits, because it very quickly, when that woman got out of her car, I could feel this whole sense of nervousness and awkwardness, and people driving by the other way were looking at me like I was a monster, that she would have to be out of her car yelling at me. I could say, I don't know what they were thinking, but that was my thought. But it created a sensation that was awkward, right?
Sure.
So I look for that, not because I'm trying to subject people to it, but because I realize we're already subjected to it to any degree that we're maintaining these thoughts. And to not engage on that level only helps to brew that sort of cauldron more and more and more. So I like to step into it a little bit. Again, not trying to provoke and to do, but I don't even mind provoking, quite frankly. I don't see anything wrong with provocation. I'm not trying to hurt. I'm trying to do what I can to be with people in the potential of beginning to diffuse the thing that they're already struggling with, that they're already being brutalized with, that they're already harming themselves over. The self-abuse and self-abasement and all those things are not accidentally attached to the word self. The self-loathing, the self-hatred, the self-fear, all that stuff is there because of a knowingness that we're doing something that is absolutely crippling our entirety in terms of our human capacity. But
So,
John, one thing to think about also is that it's not just happening in the person you're seeing it in. It's happening in everybody to any degree that they're maintaining those kind of thoughts. Everybody's doing this because it's capable that we all do this. If we have any degree of sanity whatsoever. Again, I'll exclude those people who may be incapable of reckoning with what's happening. I would suggest maybe there are those that can do that. Certainly a person in a coma would be one of those. My suspicion is that anybody conscious enough to create hallucinations and trances and make believe that that's all there is a pretty creative individual to live an entire life making believe that all they've created is all that there is. That's a pretty highly developed line of thinking. So I'm not suggesting nobody do that. I'm suggesting that if they do that and think it's true, that's the problem. And to talk to them about their images, just like Fed talked about the guy from The Beautiful Mind, beginning to have peace with the relationships he had with those ideas that he had that seemed to haunt him.
Yeah, clearly, but we're excluding the schizophrenic in this conversation.
No. I am schizophrenic when I think who I am is what I think. I've got a persona in me that isn't me, acting against me and not in my favor, that I'm managing and maintaining while claiming to be subject to its problems and a slave.
Wait, I thought you were schizophrenic if you think it's real.
That's the transition, yes. But I must think it's real to be acting on its behalf and to be fighting it and to be denying it and to be, I can say I don't think it's real today. But the fact is, I think it's real enough to continue to have inner conflict at times. I think it's real enough when I feel overwhelmed by a circumstance and think I'm going to rush back to my thinking and who I think I am real quick to solve the problem. There's something going on that I haven't quite conceded. And my suspicion is that as I do it with myself, it's the idea that everyone else doesn't know better and that I'm doing it alone that continues to foster those ideas, rather than begin to see that the more I do it with others, the quicker I will be in an environment that allows me to recognize that it is something I never have to do, because it's something nobody ever has to do either. I'm not singling people out for what's wrong in them. I'm singling them out for what's right between us, and starting to engage on that level with, I start to be provocative in a productive manner rather than one that creates reactivity to prove that I have some rightness to be seen in my thinking, rather than just simply allow that person to go where they're going and do what they're doing, and not, the reactivity doesn't bother me like it used to. My dad was fucking, he was a Marine, man. And when he yelled, it would just send shivers through the whole family. And I used to feel that stuff for years. And some of that's still in my system that I can feel.
Shit, yeah.
But it dissipates.
Yeah, but that's not, I don't think a beautiful mind is talking about that.
It doesn't have to be for us to be suffering some of the same consequences. We don't have to identify exactly with something for it not to be happening to us. And even if it's subtle, John, it's insane. Just like the idea that I can drink and use alcohol is subtle, but it's insane to think I can do that when all my experience tells me that every time I start, I don't know how to stop. I do more than I think I want. I do it heavier. You know, the whole thing goes batshit crazy, and I blame it on the batshit rather than my own craziness.
But aren't you also scratching at the, when you're talking about schizophrenia and you're talking about about a beautiful mind, you're talking about the difference between our normal waking consciousness, which if we go back to like James, which a lot of AA is based on, right? Because he wrote the varieties of religious experience that Bill read and ate up in the hospital, right? And
right.
And he talks about different forms of consciousness, right? And we may go through life, most of our life, without even suspecting their existence. But actually, when the requisite stimulus is applied, all of a sudden that sort of he has a beautiful word for it, like a phrase, like a filmic screen, I think, or the filmiest of screens. All of a sudden, you know, they no account of the universe that we have can be a map, right?
Yes.
So we're talking about that sort of inability to put our actual finger on the difference between consciousness and levels of consciousness. And I think that's what we mean when we talk about a schizophrenic versus a genius versus someone in a coma versus our everyday sort of rational consciousness, right?
Well, but let's think of it just as us here. And if it's hard for us to talk about this sort of split and division that we have within our own experience, it's probably just going to be a long conversation about all kinds of other big ideas about how these things have been termed through history. If we've been thinking through history that what we think is who we are and that self is in fact a part of us, and it's largely been, the ego has been thought of as this thing that, you know, Freud divided it into superego, id, and ego, right? So there's parts that function and parts that we've been nurturing, simply thinking about thinking as a source of self rather than beginning to see it's just thinking. It isn't a source of self. The source of self is, in fact, the ultimate thing we all share. It isn't even an individuation of self. We have individual bodies, but yet we have this absolute knowing nature that seems to be consistent between all of us. And that would be the I. And I in Latin, I said this, I think, before you came on earlier, I in Latin, or ego in Latin, is the word I. So we've even taken ego, which just means I, it means the source of my present awareness of my existence. We've taken that and turned it into this other thing that it doesn't even mean. Technically, we've retooled it as false self, some image of self, right? And if thinking is thinking about thinking, what's the image? The image is of thought, not reality, not truth, not self. It's just thinking of itself. So that split is the idea that that's truth and reality. And there's definitely an internal dialogue that starts up that we loathe, that we are contemptful over because we feel condemned to, because it goes on as long as we make believe that that combination of thinking about thinking is in fact who we are. And I suspect this is what Bill was aiming at. Because he said the problem was in the mind. The disease of addiction's in the mind. Buddha talked about attachment being the problem, the suffering and struggling in life. He didn't talk about life being struggle. He just knew that people seem to have this attachment problem with desire. When you want something, you got to have it kind of thing. To want something and have to have it means we don't have it now. If I'm not fulfilled now in some way that may exclude all other things, because it's not about tangible stuff, it's about a present state of being that's absolute, my decision about things are not going to be, I'm not going to feel condemned to them. I'm just going to say, oh, I have a choice. I can eat now. I can eat one of those things. I don't need to eat 40 of those things. The idea that I have to have it, again, is redundant, just like thinking about thinking. Having to have itself would mean having to have constantly, right? That becomes the self of having. Self-fulfilling. Why? Because it's just, it's the thing thinking about itself. Having, thinking about having. We have to have it. Just like we think it. But we think we talk to ourselves. We think about ourselves. And really all we're doing is thinking and talking to our thoughts. Very different distinction in my experience. Clarified a lot for me when I just started thinking, okay, well, that's a thought. It isn't me. I don't have a persona to defend. It's not my life-threatening. It's not life-threatening to consider somebody else's thought. It's just a thought they have. So when my thoughts just became thoughts, all of a sudden I thought, oh yeah, other people have thoughts too. Nice. Whatever their thought, whatever it is. Just a very different, it diffuses the whole idea that our life depends on defending or protecting or engaging or insisting, demanding. All that stuff starts to dissipate. Not that we can't do those things, but when we do them, we'll know clearly we can stop anytime because we're choosing to do it. It's not something we have to do. It's not something we must do. It's not something we shall do. It's not something we should be doing, could be doing. It's what we're doing that we start recognizing is what we're doing. The impact on our experience is always now. Where we are, what we're doing now. And our essence never changes. That's the beauty of simplicity. It never changes, always the same. So for me to think of it differently is to have a different experience of it. And then I'm not even experiencing it. I'm experiencing what I'm thinking about it. And when I think my thinking is it, that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, I think that in an attempt to surf that with you,
To surf that?
To surf that with you.
I love that.
What James means and what Bill found and what you're saying, I think, is that balance that we have to be careful. I just texted you about this actually earlier in the meeting, Jack, because I didn't want to go off on a rabbit hole, but it's about letting that thinking about thoughts, which I can get into when I think about the different layers of consciousness, and maybe even James gets into it himself when he tries to he defines them as 4 different things, right? But what I texted you earlier was an interesting quote by Whitman, which is like, it's all, the thoughts that are true poke through, right?
Yes.
And
well, the fact is, Sturgis, we think of them in these sort of physicality terms because words are defined to define physicality very often. But they don't quite poke through. They're just ever present when we stop insisting. In that thing that James said, he says transcendental natural self hardens into the unnatural self, important and overly active ego. It hardens. Only in our thinking does that happen.
Yeah. Well, that's Whitman actually, but that's not what I mean. It's the idea that when
yeah.
you let thoughts thinking about keep thinking about themselves, that's when the hardening begins.
No,
and
no,
the
no.
self starts to become aggrandizing, right?
No, it only
Versus
starts when we start.
versus
when we
the self deflation that James is really trying to get us to focus on.
but
Ego deflation, I mean.
Sturgis, it's when we think they're real that the selves, when they're thinking about themselves, think of it. Now we're not only schizophrenic, we've got multiple personalities going on inside of our head because thoughts thinking of themselves become the selves we think we are when we think those thoughts are real and true. Thoughts are something we do. They're imagined. They're images. They are narratives about what's happening. They are not what's happening except to the doing that they're doing. The thinking is thinking what it's thinking. It's when it's thinking about something, it's not actually thinking about the thing it's thinking about, or it's thinking about it. It isn't thinking of it.
Oh, hi.
So it's that transition of making believe the thoughts are true and real that starts to
You
harden.
got salmon from Whole Foods?
Jackie, we hear you.
Eat in about 15 minutes.
Okay, handsome.
It's the thinking we're doing about them that seems to harden when we have them as they are not, because there's opposition and resistance to what they are. Follow?
So,
Sorry, yes, I absolutely do. And I guess we can create all of these different cosmos and beings in our own head, right? But I guess
Yes.
the point is yes. And I think all of the things I described are acknowledging that, right? I think
Just keep in mind, keep one thing in mind, Sturgis. As well as this can be defined, it's still nothing ever other than what it is right now. And it is intact and it is whole and it is complete. And it's never going to come down to understanding. When we can concede that the absolute nature is the absolute nature, thoughts then have a chance to begin to notice the impact we have on our experience of that absolute nature in a productive or a destructive manner. Because we're starting to see thoughts for being thoughts and choices we make and the impacts they have on our experience. We're not seeing them as reality anymore, just simply something, a tool we're using, utilizing, and how well or bad we utilize it depends on our health and our functional capacity. So the problem, here's a question that just came to me, and I don't know the answer to this yet, and I'm going to find out, is did Bill have his experience, that white light experience from the mountaintop, feeling like a cold wind was blowing, realizing that this message could be carried to alcoholics everywhere before or after he read William James? And my sense is when William James clarified the way he clarified things so beautifully, we often get stuck on the words rather than see that he's pointing to something that must be what we know. We're not relying on his words for it. He's nudging us in a direction, like you just suggested, of beginning to concede an awareness we already have. And that's ultimately where the freedom is. That's the admission that I am the source of the problem when I'm creating it. And the source of the solution has never been a problem, and it's shared by us rather than part and parcel of these individuations that we create and the words we use that identify the thoughts we're having.
Well, I've had yes, absolutely. And I mean, this brings up another question for me that, is probably one for another day. But and I have a Post-it note above my desk that is something my professor said in college that I've kept for over 20 years when we were studying Nietzsche, which was that our purest contact with reality lies in breaking free from the trap of language. Standing in absolute attentive presence, right? That's beyond description,
I would take it a step further, though, and to begin to realize that we have it so real as to think it's something we can break out of or need to break out of, rather than to begin to see it's our commitment to it as thinking it's real that is the broken aspect of it. That it's just words. They're just used as reference points. It's like a finger pointing to a mountain. It's easy to see the mountain, but we might not be seeing exactly what that finger is pointing to on that mountain, right? They're references. And the fact is, if they were referencing something we didn't know, it would never work. They would never be substantial enough. Never. And when we think all we know is what we think, we keep clinging to them as though they are our source rather than start to see they're all just fingers pointing to the mountain that's always there. It's always present. It's always here. And then the clarity of what's being said becomes clearer because there's something magical about words when they're beginning to function as words rather than as these conclusive aspects of life and reality. So if it is what it is, it's always been what it is. It hasn't been because we thought about it, or William James, it was that way before he wrote his beautiful prose, or Whitman or Emerson or any of those guys that wrote so
Well,
beautiful.
the beautiful thing, and going back to Shakespeare, is that everyone has found sort of a way to encounter. I mean, each one of these geniuses has found the genus, right? A way to sort of find their own frame of
to point at
the
it.
truth, right? Yeah.
So here's the thing that's beautiful about that, Sturgis. And I think Shakespeare knew this. If we didn't know it, I'm going to repeat what I just said in a different way. If we didn't know what we know, no pointing would ever help. But the fact that a single finger pointed in a direction can give us so much clarity is the thinking that we're now finally aligning with what we always have known, that starts to give us the impression that is profound, because now our healthy bodily experience is experiencing the blissful nature of an absolute state of presence. That's exactly what the people witness when they get these near-death experiences where their literal body's dead, but they're witnessing it from a point of view that's completely pure, that's still conscious, that's completely aware, that's seeing without their eyes, that's hearing without their ears, and it's all functioning while they're dead. And the awareness is welcoming and a sense of place. They all talk about it, and they also say, I can't even explain this to the point of the words. They say, I can never really put words to it. Every one of them. And yet they all talk about, it felt like I fit. It felt like I was more welcome than I'd ever been. What is it about our present experience that means how committed are we to our limited thoughts to make believe that we can only witness that when we get pushed so far past them through these traumatic experiences and these near-death experiences, which are really near-life experiences, because we're starting to witness the absolute source of life in our consciousness, rather than make believe it's only going to get there when we finally break through this impossible thing we consistently make believe is going to be reinforced by the thinking we're doing. We're literally creating the womb and talking about breaking out of it while we're insisting it's real and true. So the imagery and narratives that are developed often speak to that.
He's a narcissist because that's the way he thinks.
John,
what's that?
I'm just trying to help John go on mute. All right, or maybe I can't.
John, your sound is coming in and out. It's pretty erratic.
Yeah, that's narcissistic.
What's
right there? Another example.
Hello?
I don't know if they know that they're talking.
John,
sounds like they're in the car.
Oh, are you guys talking?
Yeah, I've been trying to interrupt you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we haven't been able to hear you.
So my point before, and I know you're getting ready to depart, but
no, we can go as long as you want.
My point before was that I've been accused of being narcissistic because I say things that I'm thinking about the things that are happening to others.
Yes.
And so so the analogy is, if I don't know, just if I am provoking someone verbally, is that not narcissistic? And isn't that, in a sense, the sickness?
Only if you're doing it for the self you think you are and think that it's going to prove you right, rather than see it as an opportunity for them to also begin to share with you and themselves an aspect of something you both share. And If my experience, John, is when somebody tells me I'm narcissistic, which I hear a lot, I just agree because to any degree, I'm thinking about things that aren't true as being true. That is, in fact, what narcissism is. It's the adulation I have for the thinking I'm doing as being true and real that isn't true or real.
That's okay if the machine is doing that internally because it's a waste of time. I understand. And I understand the obsession of it, and I understand this discussion of it. But when it's outwardly delivered,
Yeah.
that's narcissism, right?
I don't know. It depends on what the motivation is. If it's
What if the
trying,
motivation
if you're
might-
trying to do it to serve the self you think you are, I would say yes. If you're doing it to express that you also struggle and suffer with this and want to share with that person in it so that you can begin to interact on a level that's productive on their behalf, I would say that is not thinking solely of yourself, but actually beginning to function on a level that is inclusive rather than exclusive.
Yeah, I'm not the latter. You know what, you come from, you talked about your father, I could talk about my father for hours, but he was a monster. So you come from the monster, who throws you downstairs and locks you in closets and is a verbally, physically abusive, literally a monster. And then you become a little bit of that monster. Like that monster surfaces still within me. And that's why I wanted to become, the best fighter in the world, so to speak. So the point is that without narcissism as a defense, I probably, wouldn't even exist anymore. You're living with a 270-pound monster and you're a 100-pound 12-year-old.
Well, that 12-year-old made decisions about what was happening that you have continued to live with since the point at which those things that were monstrous stopped happening. So the monster that was created is the one you have created and maintained since then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm not ignorant of that.
Okay. So it isn't to say we can't do that. And the freedom becomes recognizing what we are doing, in fact. And it's always in the moment, John. What I do now with all of those memories is the impact I create. It isn't what happened back then because that is no longer happening. And there is no actual then to even consider. There is no past in reality. There is no future in reality since reality is in the present. And it's what I do with those things right now that has the impact. And that takes a minute to...
neurological... Sorry, I stepped on you.
Go ahead.
And the neurological pathway that exists within me that is so sensitive still can be ignited.
Yes.
Even at 66 or 67, I can't remember who's older than you or me, but even at this age, I can be in a verbal situation that I'm uncomfortable with, and that synapse fires.
Yes.
And I'm 10 years old again.
So think of the words you're using. You're talking about a neurological pathway. That's a visual that we create to give this reality. It isn't reality. That's just an image that you create. It isn't to say that it isn't there, but I would suggest whatever's there is there doing what it's doing, first of all. And when you say you return to the 10-year-old, I wouldn't say there's any place to return. I would say that you're simply contemplating what you have not resolved from that age, but it's now that you're contemplating it. So the solution is where you are now, not where you think of then. And to think of it as then is part of the problem because it's actually what's happening now that you're doing to continue to re-stimulate it and maintain it. If it's not been dealt with, the pressure and the resistance is going to continue to maintain. It's really what's defined as trauma. And I don't think any of this is post-traumatic trauma. My experience is it's present traumatic trauma because nothing that happened back then is impacting me other than what I'm thinking about it presently now, always.
Well, but right now is the regurgitation of it in remembrance.
Yes.
For you guys, right? I'm trying to articulate where I think it stems from. But in the moment is such an instantaneous reaction.
Yes. As though we have no choice, right?
Exactly.
That's addiction right there. That's exactly what it is. It's the idea that it's happening to us, not being caused by us. And why would that happen? Because we try to pretend that not thinking about things is the solution, while in fact, those things we're not thinking about are brewing in us. So when they finally reveal themselves in some way, we act as though it's a surprise because we've thought that we had them hidden and they wouldn't show up and wouldn't rear their head. That's all a construct of a very conniving ability of this somewhat demonic, impish self that we are constantly trying to get right, the mischievous nature of that thing, trying to stir things up to say, here I am, you haven't gotten rid of me yet.
Yep.
It's an indication. Those things are clear indications. The beauty of it is that they're clear indications. And the feeling of it is the feeling that we've been resisting. And as you begin to embrace the feeling and embrace the actuality of that, you'll start seeing. One of the big transitions in my experience was starting to realize that I was thinking things I wasn't thinking. And when that first occurred to me, I thought, that's stupid. And then I thought, it doesn't matter how stupid it is for me to be doing it and thinking that it's the smartest thing to do. And as I started to just concede that, I started having things that I didn't think I was thinking come up because I was no longer working to keep them down in ways I didn't even think I was doing. The awareness of the greater sense of my own ability to connive and scheme and manipulate my experience to pretend I'm not even aware of what I'm aware of became more obvious. By thinking that one thought, I'm thinking things I don't even think I'm thinking. And then I started thinking, well, this is where I've been hiding that stuff in my seeming subconscious that in the big book, Bill talks about look for conditions and causes and conditions. What are the causes? What I'm doing in the seeming darkness that I don't think are happening because they're motivating me in ways that I think are happening to me. I say things like I'm caught off guard, meaning I'm normally on guard, but now this thing that just happened has caught me off guard because I didn't expect it. It wasn't part of my plan. It wasn't in my scheme of imagination and expectation. So I'm caught off guard. How possible is it that I could think that what happens is only going to be what I think should happen and that I'm caught off guard when it doesn't? When in fact, most of what's ever happened has just happened in my experience and had nothing to do with what I was thinking. It just happens.
And that's the beauty of discussion.
Yes, I would agree with that for sure. So to talk about it gives us all a chance to see that this isn't there's a lot of silence. And I appreciate that after 2.5 hours, this is kind of revved up and started to draw a little bit of the conversation. But if we're talking about this openly, it's not going to be comfortable necessarily to look at this stuff immediately. But the comfort comes in the facing of it, not because we're trying to overcome it and trying to have confidence to be bigger and stronger. But when we stop doing discouraging things, there's a certain courage that comes naturally. And it isn't even courageous. It's just the simple, absolute self. The essence of our existence, whatever that is, self or otherwise, capital self, small, whatever it is, starts to speak in terms that are accurate enough to be valuable to everyone, rather than someone, sometime, somebody, sometime, someplace. And that's the essence of the conversation here. Being able to start to say, oh, it's where I go when we leave here. We're in a little bit of an ivory tower talking about this amongst ourselves intentionally. During the rest of our week, we're in situations that seem to be very much cultivated from that culture of thinking that I've suffered with my whole life. It's often, if not easy, to deal with that, especially when I know now that I would rather deal with it directly rather than indirectly. And that doing that can often cause the seeming problem I'm trying to avoid. And be willing to say, okay, I'm willing to do that too. I'm willing to stand right where that is and let it be and let them do what they do. And I'll just watch. I'll be with them. I'll be a witness. Just like I can be a witness to my own inner experience and dialogue. When I start noticing what I'm doing with that persona I think is me, I start becoming a lot better listener to what other people are doing when they think they're projecting a persona that they want me to buy. Just becomes more obvious. And the actual awareness of that dissipates things for other people because the space around them changes from being one that seems very tense to being one that seems to have a little more relief. And that's ultimately what this discussion was originally designed. We've been at it 2.5 years or so now. It was originally designed to open that conversation up, and it's taken us some time to begin to open it. But I suspect today is a very good example of the capacity of our potential to discuss these things. And I miss points. I'm not here to think I know everything about all this stuff in ways that I can deal with it immediately. I just do the best I can with what I've done and what I have to give you a chance to begin to interact with each other in a way that becomes gainful, that you can take out into the world and say, oh, I've already done that. What's natural is so easy to repeat because it always works. We don't have to think about it at all. It just works. It becomes so common so quickly that thousands of years of mistaking an identity for who we are as who we thought are evaporate in seconds in the application of things that are correct. Does not take years. It doesn't take everybody. It doesn't. If I'm not willing to do what I can, I'm going to think about what everybody else isn't doing to justify not doing what I can. That's narcissistic. That's self-centered. My self-interest is actually an interest in a self that doesn't exist when I do that. And how much interest could there ever be paid with that kind of investment? None. No wonder I feel empty and avoid and want to avoid things and think I'm better when I do. Sturgis, I'm going to read through what you sent, and I appreciate all that too, because there have been some very strong voices to this through history. And I think identifying it as an addiction rather than this seeming problem that has all these other narratives attached to it that we need to break through and overcome and all that kind of stuff, really just keeps us on the path constantly, is thinking it's real enough to break through or overcome. And my sense is Bill Wilson said it. His whole introduction of the freedom from alcohol, he also said, having been granted perfect release from alcoholism, why shouldn't we by the same means be able to achieve perfect release from all our other difficulties and defects?
Yes.
All of them.
Yes.
That's a good question. And he goes on to answer it.
Yes.
Perhaps this is the riddle of the universe. Who are perplexed by riddles, but it's humans who think, meaning that we can be stuck thinking about it forever. But the answer, he says, may be only in the mind of God, meaning if there is an absolute source, and that is the mind that we all share, then that is the answer, because there is no problem. And it isn't because I think about it, but when I do think about it, my bodily functions start to straighten out very quickly, and my thinking starts to straighten out, and I start thinking things I would never think productively and gainfully and usefully if I was simply thinking about my thinking as being my sole source, because all of that turns into a drowning pool of stagnation that turns toxic. Just like water left alone. It's not healthy to drink. After a certain point, it'll kill you.
Yeah, I think it's so incredible that we're able to start to draw sort of a line of history back to all of these incredible thinkers. And I think, I mean, there's through what Bill found and delivered through insight and language and writing and intuition and reason, and sort of the balancing act between all three of those, which it's just really profound to me, that as a reminder that we've always been sort of talking about the same thing.
Exactly. Not sort of, but actually.
Yeah.
Well, and to John's point, not everyone, writing is a developed skill. It's an art form. Speaking is something that pretty much everybody does. Not everybody, but pretty much everybody. So it tends to be our primary usable form of communication between humans. And that's why this is being done this way. This is why I thought the podcast was the perfect environment, because people listening out there, if you're listening, your reactions and your responses are in fact your communication. They're your participation. They're your answers to these conversations and thoughts. And watching them and seeing them, you'll start seeing the relationship you have to the thing you think you are. And it isn't to say we can't have that relationship and we can't reflect on the things we do that are attached to words about the things we think we are. It's to say we can absolutely do that, but to think it's our only source and our only lifeline is to think that thing is true and real rather than just what we're thinking. And thinking is imagination. It's a narrative around ideas. Oliver Wendell Holmes said that words are the skin of ideas. They're just giving us a glimpse into the superficial nature of those ideas that can be obviously expanded. And Rumi, I interviewed Moeen on here, and Moeen introduced me to the fact that the guy Rumi learned from was a guy named Chalmers, who was a seeming mystic, we've called them, but they're not mystical if in fact they're dealing with reality. They're only mystical to the idea that we think thinking is real, and in fact all of a sudden everything infinite becomes mystical. It's the opposite way around. Our thinking is mystical and the absolute nature is true and real. So it has been written about and spoken about since the beginning of time. Even Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and all those guys back to the beginning had ideas that were pretty. I mean, I believe it was Aristotle who even imagined that an atom was part of a substructure that held the whole universe together. This is before microscopes existed. It's before calculus was existed. It's before mathematics was effectively existed. And he was imagining those things from his point of view. Why? He knew. He was simply expressing it. He was exploring, he was looking, and as a result, he was seeing and he was sharing. Pretty profound, because profound means forefinding. And if I'm interested in looking, I'm going to see things. And if I'm interested in actually looking, I'm going to see exactly what I'm seeing rather than what I think. And start to allow it to introduce itself to me in the ways that I can't possibly imagine by thinking of its superficiality as all that I see and know.
That guy I just put in the chat, Sam Harris, who, interestingly enough, Jack, was someone I found right in the week before I met you during the pandemic. He talks a lot about this, and he talks a lot about poetry as sort of the bridge between silence and thinking, right? And one of the things that I always think about for him is he talks about it as having poetry specifically, which is of course Shakespeare, to bring it back in, back around the block. He talks about poetry's ability to interrupt the momentum of story.
Yeah.
And like unweave the narrative thread. And I just think that's so powerful around this conversation too, because we talk a lot about that. I mean, you do it very consciously, right?
Well, and my sense is that the abstract nature of something that isn't reasonable, because reason is a function of thinking, reason is a function of an idea of relative things, relationships. And if the infinite spirit, if the infinite knowing, if the infinite present isn't about relationships, it's about the all-inclusiveness of something that isn't divisible, it's indivisible, right? That's really to what's relative abstract, but actually what's relative is abstract to it, right? So poetry and art is often trying to take our experience, like contemporary art, modern art, is often not using figurative images, but things that are not figurative to provoke imagery in us of our own awareness. And they're like Rorschach tests for individuals to reveal this greater landscape of our own experience that is often left diminutive, diminished, depreciated by the limited thinking we do about what we think is true and real, rather than what actual reality and truth, contemplating what reality and truth actually is. And my sense is the paradoxes in AA come out of that. We die to live. We win. We surrender to win. All those things seem to be opposite and contrary to the kind of thinking we do, and yet they reveal this freedom that is absolute. If we didn't know it, we wouldn't be able to even comprehend it. And we don't have to comprehend it any more than apprehend it for it to be all that it is. And as I begin to eliminate the limits of my seeming comprehension, I begin to see that everything was always beyond the limits and always within the limits. It never was anywhere else other than exactly where I am, you are, we are, it is, whatever things are always present in that state. Thinking they're not is the problem. And it's only a problem as long as we think that's true. So seeing this clearly is interesting, because to think about it clearly ends up having those aha moments, because thinking only seems to be obsessive when we're trying to maintain thoughts that aren't true as true. That's the only thing that I can find that seems to be the source of it, which is a lie, which would be ego and all kinds of other concepts that are only ever in thought. They're not in reality. They're not outside our heads. We can act on them, and the destruction we create and the misery we create and the pain we create is evidence that we're creating something that isn't natural. It isn't healthy. It isn't helpful. And it's certainly possible because a loving nature gave us all the possibility to do whatever we think we want to do. No inhibition whatsoever in that regard, which makes responsibility an interesting concept, because it means the ability to respond and start to realize it's how we're responding to things and or reacting to them that divides the difference between our contemplative consideration of what's happening and our reactive nature of defending what isn't actually happening at all. All those reactions, John, are always over issues that aren't happening, because the only thing that thing not happening relies on is the thought thinking about it and defending it, which is naturally defensive because it knows there's nothing to defend. The only thing it has to actually appear real is the defense. And to defend, to hold your hand closed and say that you've got $1 million worth of jewelry in there and then have somebody kill you to steal it and find out there's nothing there, would be insane to think about it from beginning to end. And that's kind of what we do in the ideas we have about the treasure we keep to ourselves and think we are, and someday we'll realize and be benefited from it, when in fact the benefit of it is pain and sorrow and misery. We already know what the promise is.
Yep.
So this went a little longer than normal, Fed, and some of the early meetings we went as long as 4 hours and 40 minutes, because once the conversation gets warmed up, which takes a minute, there seems to be a lot, things start to kind of pop up that don't always occur immediately, because there's, I suspect, a certain slumber that starts to get stimulated and we kind of wake up to those things. Think of this idea about the self as like a dream. It has an impact on us as though it's real, but it's a dream. And the spiritual awakening is beginning to see that we are awakened spiritually, that we aren't asleep. We've never been asleep. We've only been thinking we were asleep. And there's a Russian philosopher, Xxix, I believe his name is, who said that humans are asleep thinking dreaming they're awake. And so it's just beginning to bring the fullness of the steps from the step one to where we give up any sense of power over alcohol and drugs, and all of a sudden start to be able to recognize that we have some freedom from it and have no compelling interest in it, and start to realize the problem beneath that, now that we no longer have a cure, is the unmanageability of thinking that we're doing that has no basis in reality. The same kind of thinking that I used to think I could control and enjoy my drugs, that kept me trying to prove it over and over again by doing so much of it that it made no sense to make believe I could control it when I was completely out of control doing it, trying to prove I could control it. That kind of cycle is exactly what's underlying in the mind that we do in all the different ways that we can fracture and detach to give ourselves some sense that it's out there rather than in here, and constantly blame and shame and fault and feel victimized by our own actual thoughts. Interesting. We would become the victim and responsible for it simultaneously. We become the master and the slave, the oppressor and the oppressed simultaneously, which ironically is revealing the absolute nature of things. Both ends are not apart. They're not divided. Anyway.
Well, I apologize for chiming in so late.
No, John, I consider this early, given that that's when you started. So let's look more at that. I don't think I got to all the issues and points you were thinking about, and let's do that and continue and think during the week of things that might be useful to everybody to bring up as things we're admitting openly, publicly, and presently that we do, so we can talk about it and start to look at it as something that we're all doing in seeming different ways in the same way, and start to see that as a group. I guarantee you the expansiveness of this conversation will all of a sudden perk up and go to levels, and things will be said, because thoughts will be had that so far exceed the bounds of looking at the problem, begin to actually contemplate the nature of our existence in ways that will become profoundly beneficial to anyone making believe they're alone and singled out and having this happen to them. Just naturally happens because that is our nature. What we're doing in all those other ways is unnatural and unhealthy.
Okie dokie.
Love you guys
Take care.
and gals, but I think
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, everybody.
You got
Thank
it,
you, everybody.
Anthony.
Love you
Meet
guys.
all.
Au revoir.
Arrivederci.